Okay, good evening, everybody. It's 6 o'clock, and so we will actually reconvene. So first of all, Madam Deputy Clerk, do we have a quorum?
Yes, Mayor Patterson, we have quorum. At this time, I would also like to confirm that all members of council, with the exception of Councillor Osanek and Councillor Stroud, are currently present. At this time in the meeting, we also have from staff Lanny Hurdle, Chief Administrative Officer, Paige Agnew, Commissioner of Community Services, Craig Desjardins, Acting Commissioner of Corporate Services, Peter Hugenboss, Commissioner of Business, Environment and Projects, Brad Joyce, Commissioner of Transportation and Public Works, Desiree Kennedy, CFO and City Treasurer, Sean Armstrong, Fire Chief, John Bolagnone, City Clerk, Jeff Bumstead, Chief Information Officer, Luke Falwell, Director of Engineering, Lana Folds, Director of Financial Services, Brent Fowler, Director of Corporate Assets, Management and Fleet, Spiros Canellos, Director of Facilities Management and Construction, JC Kenny, Director of Communications and Customer Service, Jenna Morley, Director of Legal Services and City Solicitor, Tim Park, Director of Planning Services, Deanne Roberts, Director HR and Organization Development, Karen Santucci, Director of Public Works and Solid Waste, Ian Semple, Director of Transportation Services, Kyle Bolton, Operations Manager, Scarlett Isles, Manager of Financial Planning, Jason Follett, Acting Manager, Solid Waste Operations, Janet James, Deputy City Clerk, Marissa Mascaro, Manager, Transportation Infrastructure, Julie Salter-Keene, Manager, Climate Leadership, Troy Stubinsky, Operations Manager, Public Works, Jeffrey Walker, Manager, Taxation and Revenue. Joining us from our finance team, financial analysts Monica Purcell, Christine Patton, Matt Scott, Melanie Bale, Emily Reed, and Jessica Breckenridge. Ian Sullivan is our meeting host, and Chris Sabrin is here for technical support. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Deputy Clerk. Okay, next up, are there any disclosures of potential pecuniary interest? Councillor Vaughn.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you, just to reiterate the one I announced last night, I, Ryan Bowman, of the Council of the Corporation of the City of Kingston, declare my pecuniary interest in the matter of Clause 6.7 of the Agenda Report 21-290 as an employee of Utilities Kingston. It may be perceived that I have a conflict with the Committee of the Whole Report 21-290 insofar as it relates to Utilities Kingston and any associated bylaws. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Deputy Mayor Ostroff.
Can I just have a minute to, I got 1 second here. It's just printing so I can read it, please. I misplaced it. I'm so sorry. I, Gary Ostroff of the Council of the Corporation of the City of Kingston, declare my pecuniary interest in the matter of the operating budget of the Kingston Access Services, as I have a family member that uses these services. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Neal.
Just very, excuse me, first time I've spoken all day, so sorry. Quick question for the clerk. For the three of us that declared a conflict on the hospital funding piece, I don't believe that comes up till the last night, in which case we can declare that.
Yes, we'll manage it then. Thank
Perfect.
you.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, if there are no other disclosures of pecuniary interest, we will move on. So as you know, we have a number of staff presentations to work through various departments. We will begin with an overview of the budget. Just to let you know, my intention at this point is to have us recess somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock tonight. So my intention is not to go past 10 o'clock tonight, and then we will reconvene at 6 p.m. tomorrow. So for whatever staff presentations we don't get to tonight, and then for budget deliberations. Okay, so with that, we have no delegations, and so we will move right to number 4, the municipal operating and capital budget overview. And I see that our CFO and Treasurer, Ms. Kennedy, is on the screen and ready to go. Ms. Kennedy, take it away, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and good evening to all council and to staff. Before I get started here, I just wanted to recognize there was a long list of staff there, and I know all the directors are with us tonight. We also have, along with my Director of Financial Services, Lana Foltz, our Manager of Financial Planning, Scarlett Isles, and a number of our financial analysts, all of them that are here tonight to support their various departments in terms of the budget and any questions that you might have. So I just want to recognize them. This is the group that does all the work, and I get to take the credit. So I thought I'd better give them a little bit of credit tonight, knowing they're all here. So I'm going to start tonight. I just want to do an overview for council. This will be a bit of a prelude to some of the more detailed information that you'll hear tonight and tomorrow night from the commissioners. If you can move to the next slide, please. So looking at the operating budget just at a glance and what we'll be looking at tonight. So the 2022 operating budget, it does have a municipal tax increase of 1.1% plus 1% for our incremental capital levy. It maintains all of our frontline service levels with consideration, obviously, for pandemic impacts, assumptions for inflation, and some growth-related service demand that's included. I think I can sum it up overall that it is definitely a pandemic recovery budget. And as you'll hear tonight from me as well as from my colleagues, the impact that continues on the budget with respect to the pandemic and the pandemic recovery, particularly with challenges in reduced revenues that will continue and service costs that are coming back online. As you'll see on the slide, the 1.1 plus 1% equates to a $75 impact to an average homeowner. In terms of pandemic impact, as I said, we continue to have a revenue shortfall of about $6 million if we look back to pre-pandemic levels. And I will go a little more detail in terms of some of the various areas that continue to have revenue shortfalls, but certainly about $6 million that we are forecasting will come back online over the next 2 or 3 years. However, expenditures primarily coming back to pre-pandemic levels, which of course is creating a little bit of a gap. And we do have some Safe Restart grant monies that will continue for 2022 of about $800,000 with respect to transit. Just to remind council, we do have a separate levy for the County of Frontenac services that will be included on the tax bill as a separate line item, as well as the contribution to the University Hospitals Kingston Foundation that council just recently approved. The other thing just to keep in mind, the property assessment values, as most of you know, property assessments will remain for 2022 and for 2023 at the 2020 assessed levels. And so that means that those assessments are currently based on a January 16 value. So they're certainly getting very quickly out of date. There is continued discussion happening with MPAC and the province. I know there has been some municipalities that have been very vocal about continuing on at those levels into 2022 and particularly into 2023, and that needs to be moved up. So stay tuned on that. So even with the pandemic impacts on the budget, you will hear tonight a number of things that staff have been able to include in this budget that I would call either growth or new initiatives or continuing with some of council's priorities. So you will see things in around the opening of the East End Community Center that will be happening late this year or early next year, some expanded transit service in the West End, some additional investment in affordable housing programs, some increased hours of care for Rideau Crest residents, investment in some initiatives that council's previously approved, things like equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives and policy development, and of course, ongoing climate change initiatives and corporate asset management planning and investment in our assets. So just a few things that you'll see as we continue to look at the detail within this budget. Next slide, please. Our CIO mentioned this last night, but just to remind council, the tax rate target that council had previously approved for 2022 was 2.4%. However, the recent council motion to remove $800,000 of the hospital support out of the budget has brought that down to an approved tax increase now of, or recommended tax increase of 2.1%. And as I said, the hospital support that's been approved will show as a separate line item on the tax bill, which equates to about a 1% levy. Next slide, please. So in terms of our operating budget summary, just a little bit of the numbers. Our total gross budget is about $408 million for 2022. We have about $140 million of non-tax revenues, which means we have a tax requirement that we need to raise of about $267 million for 2022. That's broken down into about $200 million that relates to our municipal services and about $67 million that relates to the agencies. The agencies, as you can see, represent about 25% of the total tax requirement. And I should mention that you will see a few minor differences between what's being presented tonight, both with my presentation and the commissioners, because we have made the adjustment for the hospital funding, and that was made after we had done the budget documents and the budget report. So you'll see a few things that are a little bit minor. This is one of them that actually brings your agencies down from about 27% to about 25% of the total tax requirement. Next slide, please. So in terms of that total $267 million, that's going to be made up of our payments in lieu of taxes. So our federal payments in lieu, as well as our heads and beds, of about $17 million. We have assessment growth this year of about $5.5 million, which is about 2.3%. That is a very strong assessment growth, more than what we were expecting. We had projected about, I believe it was about 3.8, maybe. I think it was about $1.7 million of additional growth over what our projections were. And we continue to see, certainly with the growth that's happening now, we're anticipating new supplementary taxes coming on the roll next year of about $3.5 million, which of course will turn into assessment growth in the following year. So that makes up our total of the 241 that we're actually billing out to the taxpayers to make up the total $267 million of tax requirement. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So from a percentage basis, you can see the 241.7 represents our 1.1 operating increase plus 1% for the capital levy. Next slide, please. I just wanted to give council a bit of an update. One of the things that we do is certainly keep an eye on tax rate increases across the province. I am a member of the Regional Single Tier Treasurers Group, and that is something that probably every meeting we have some conversation on budget and what they're looking like, and we do some surveys around where people are, what their targets are, what they're projecting, and eventually what their actuals are. The most recent survey that we did, and we had 13 different municipalities that were participating, quite a range of tax rate increases, either projected or target. A number of them are about the same timeline as we are. They're just starting into their budget deliberations now, but a range of anywhere from 1 to 6.6. If you take out a couple of those outliers, 9 of the 13 were above 2.5, and that includes their capital as well. So that's their total tax rate. The average across the board was about 3.1. So you can see that Kingston is certainly one of the lowest ones in terms of that analysis. And I think that was certainly a discussion at our last meeting, that the majority are within the, say, 3 to 4% range overall. And so certainly, I think we're in an enviable position from that group in particular. Also did a little bit of research in the last couple of days, just with some that are already underway. These are all drafts, these municipalities, which I thought were a little more comparable to us in terms of size, and ones that we tend to look at for comparisons purposes. And you can see again, all between sort of the 3 to 4.5% mark for Sudbury, Guelph, and Barrie. So it certainly just gives you a little feel of where we are. I can say certainly with the survey that the Regional Single Tier Treasurers Group did, is that rates definitely were impacted by varying levels of assessment growth as well. So 0.25% was the lowest, up to about 2.7%, so a little bit higher than our 2.3. But certainly we were at the high end as well for assessment growth, which, as you know, obviously helps us in terms of keeping that tax rate at a low level. Next slide, please. Actually, 2 more slides. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of our assumptions that we built into this budget. There is certainly some risk with the assumptions that we've used. So you'll see here in terms of CPI for our Ontario measurement, as you know, very high right now. October just came out at 4.7. And you can see I went back as far as August, and we've been over 4 since August of 2021. I also included excluding energy, the CPI excluding energy. Energy includes electricity as well as natural gas and then our gas and diesel fuels. And those are items that we look very specifically and do some market research on when we're looking at what that inflation amount might need to be that we have to incorporate. So I've pulled those out because they certainly are dealt with separately. And so without the energy, we're still in around the 3% mark. Certainly as you can see, the energy prices certainly and definitely gas has contributed to some of that over 4%. I believe looking the other day at some of the gas prices and what we're looking at, gas prices are up over 40% compared to October of the previous year. That's actually a Canadian measure as opposed to Ontario, but Ontario certainly would be roughly I would think in the same category for that. Certainly the other thing that's happening we certainly are experiencing here at the city is supply chain issues. And those are expected to continue certainly for the rest of this year. And projections are looking that at least for up to the end of 2021, that inflation is likely to remain north of that 4% mark for the rest of this year. So looking into 2022, this is definitely placing some pressure on our 2022 budgets. As I said, while we've projected a more targeted inflation calculation for things like our fuel and our utilities, for some of our more general costs like supplies or services that aren't under any specific contract terms, we have used 2% across the board for some of those costs. So certainly that's something that the staff will be keeping an eye on and we'll have to manage as we come into 2022. Certainly with respect to the projections, there is an anticipation that we'll have some strong economic momentum as we go into 2022. And of course, that will be subject to if there's continuing supply shortages and labor challenges that we're certainly experiencing today, that could limit that. But based on that and based on some of the projections that we're seeing, the Bank of Canada, who tends to try to target at that 2% mark, what we are anticipating is that as we have this strong economic momentum and we'll continue to see rising inflation as a result of that, it'll likely prompt the Bank of Canada to react and raise interest rates, perhaps sooner than later. And projected, certainly more recent projections are as early as April of 2022. Next slide. So that leads us into the interest rates. We do have a budget for our short-term bank interest, and actually, I think I've got that wrong on the slide. We've actually increased our bank interest by about $200,000 for 2022. Our long-term investment rates are remaining around the 3% mark, and we've been pretty fortunate we've been fairly conservative, and so we haven't taken a big hit on our long-term investments, and certainly our investment agents have worked well for us in terms of trying to maximize some of our investment income throughout this last couple of years. We've seen some pickup in our debenture rates, and of course we continue to monitor that. And then, as I said, we are expecting that the Bank of Canada, while it's been holding that policy rate at 0.25%, expect that we will see it start to come up. And then obviously, as a result of that, the prime rate, which has been staying fairly consistent at 2.45%, is expected to rise if the policy rate goes up in 22. Projections at up to about 2.95 and up to about 3.7 by 2023. So while that's good news for us in terms of our investment earnings, as I said, we will need to monitor particularly some of our timing of our debenture issues. I did just get actually yesterday morning an update from Infrastructure Ontario in terms of what some of the longer term rates are. As I said, we are starting to see them go up a little bit, but a 25-year debenture right now through Infrastructure Ontario is just under 3.1%. So rates are certainly staying very low in terms of our debt side, which is certainly helping us. Next slide, please. Actually, 2 more slides. So I just want to talk a little bit about what our revenues and expenditures are looking at. This slide here, certainly you can see the comparison from our 21 to our 22 budget. The large columns, obviously on the left-hand side, are our tax revenues, which we've already covered off. What I would like to address further is the third and fourth categories there, which is our fees and charges and the government funding categories. So next slide. So fees and charges. So we've turned a corner. I think last year, a lot of the discussion was about the reduced fees and charges. This year, we do have an increase, as you can see, in the fees and charges from about $45 million to about $52 million. The majority of that relates to 2 things. One, the increases that we would apply according to the fees and charges bylaw that Council just recently approved at the last meeting. But probably the more significant item is services that are transitioning back to pre-pandemic levels. So for instance, excuse me, looking at transit's up about $700,000 in 2022. And we've based that on 62% of our pre-pandemic levels. Parking is up about is down 700,000. We were a little aggressive with our parking budgets in 2021, and we've actually put them down a little bit in 2022, but we've left them at 90% of our pre-pandemic levels. Recreation is a big one. It's gone up about 3.1 million as our facilities are opening and our services are coming back. And so we're budgeting recreation at about 95% of our pre-pandemic levels. Airport, 1.1 million, which is about 60% of our pre-pandemic levels. And then arts and culture, which is about 1.9 million, is up 1.7 from last year and up to about 80% of our pre-pandemic levels. So certainly some risk here. Our best guess as we move forward into 2022 with respect to what our fees and charges revenues are going to do. And if you work that math backwards in terms of the remaining percentages to get us back to our pre-pandemic levels, then we are looking at still a shortfall of about $6 million, as I said, that hopefully we'll be able to add to our budget over the next couple of years or so. And that's assuming certainly that our service levels are going to go back to pre-pandemic, and certainly with some of the other changes. We continue to monitor things like transit and parking, which could potentially have a new norm for us going forward. And so we'll continue to monitor that. Next slide, please. Federal and provincial grants is the other category I just wanted to take a look at, because you will see that is going down a little bit. That's the provincial one is the blue bars there. One of the main things there is last year for 2021, we had all of our pandemic related funding in the budget. And so we've got a reduction of about $5 million that we had in 2021 that we won't be receiving in 2022. That's the majority of that reduction. We do still have in the 2022 budget about $800,000 of the Safe Restart transit stream funds. That was the only funding that we were able to carry forward into 2022. So as we finalize and reconcile our 2021 year end, we certainly will be trying to maximize the Safe Restart municipal funding stream, because that will be, at this point anyway, that will be expiring at the end of December of 2021. And based on what we think we're going to be using for transit in 21, we've projected about $800,000 that will be able to come forward into 2022. The other piece with transit that we've been able to include, and council might remember when we were tidying up the 2020 year end, one of the things that we did is we deferred use of some of our provincial gas tax funds in order to make use of some of the Safe Restart transit funding. And so we do have a pool of funds there for provincial gas tax, and we are starting to utilize those. And we are bringing in about $6.2 million of provincial gas tax funding in 2022 in order to keep our transit at about a 2.5% increase. And we still will have some funds from provincial gas tax that we will be able to carry forward into 2023. The other main thing in this category is our Ontario Works. We have a reduction of Ontario Works funding here of about $2.2 million. And you'll also see that when we talk about obviously our Ontario Works transfers to others will also be down by the $2.2 million, as that's 100% funded. This is really to reflect historical trends. So we did do some review this year of Ontario Works. We went back about 5 years to take a look at the trend of those expenditures. And we've been fairly conservative in terms of, particularly through the pandemic and not knowing what was going to be happening with Ontario Works, of just including an inflationary amount. So we've gone back now and we're actually doing an adjustment to take down the provincial grant projection as well as the transfer to others of about 2.2 million to get us back to more realistic trends that we've been experiencing. And the other final thing that I do want to mention in this category is we have received about $1.3 million of provincial funds with respect to Rideau Crest. And this, you'll hear more about this from Commissioner Agnew, but this funding is towards increasing the average hours of care per resident per day from an average of about 2.45 hours to about 3 hours in 2022. And at this point, the province's plan is to get our homes to be reaching 4 hours per resident per day by 2025. So that those numbers are also included in this particular slide. In terms of federal, you'll just see a slight change in the federal. I'm sure council's used to hearing this every year. We continue to experience a reduction in federal housing support for the step-down funding. So we have a reduction of about $600,000 in that category. However, that was offset by some grant funding that we've received to support our airport operations, which is also included in there. So you can see that stayed fairly consistent. Next slide, please. So I just want to move into the operating expenditure side a little bit and talk particularly about the first three categories. So our salaries and benefits, our materials and supplies, and our contracted services. And as you'll see, as I go into just a little bit of detail on these, as we return our services to pre-pandemic levels, these three categories in particular are certainly reflecting increases that align with the increases in some of our services back to those more normal levels. Next slide, please. So in terms of our wages and benefits, within this category, we have included our collective agreement requirements. We've also included an overall base compensation of about 2%, which really covers off any of our non-union as well as our benefit costs. And on average, about 2% across the board covers off most of those. We have continued to have some challenges with increases in our benefit costs, but we've also had other factors that have been able to keep that within the 2% range. We have about almost $4 million actually of additional staffing costs that I would say are costs that we have to bring back our staffing levels back to pre-pandemic levels. So against that extra 5 million or so of revenues, we've got almost $4 million of staffing costs that we're bringing back. So that's either people that had not been replaced or part-time hours that we were not incurring, as well as some other challenges we've had in terms of bringing back hiring transit drivers where we've had challenges in the past year getting those. So roughly about $4 million with respect to that. And we can see that mostly transit recreation, arts and culture, and the airport. We do have some net new hires that are included in there as well, about $1.9 million to support various council priorities, some growth-related demands, and some service changes. And I say net new hires because staff have done quite a bit of effort this year in terms of looking at our salary projections, in terms of where we can reallocate responsibilities, do things a little bit differently, or where we've, through attrition, we may not have hired one position and we've been able to move that over to cover off something else. So the 1.9 million is net new hires. You will hear more detail from the commissioners on this, but it certainly is addressing items like the investment in our equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, some of our customer service and facility resources that are going to support our new Kingston and East End Community Center. I mentioned transit service expansion that's scheduled for fall of 2022 in the West End. Some of the additional nursing positions that I just mentioned that are funded from the provincial subsidies. Some support to our affordable housing projects that are ongoing, and then a little bit of administrative support, particularly in our technology field, as well as grant administration to support some of these other items. We have included within here the reinstatement of our performance-based increases for non-union. That was taken out for our 2021 year, and we certainly will be reinstating that process for at the end of 2021 to be in effect for 2022. The other thing I just want to mention in this category, we do continue to allocate some of our salaries over to capital. For 2022, we're projecting about $11 million, which is about 8% of our total salaries and benefits that goes over to capital. And that's proportionate. It's based on a proportionate level of our staff effort that's spent on capital activities versus operating activities. And so you'll see that mostly in departments such as engineering, facilities, recreation for facilities and parks, our IS&T, and then of course our major projects office has some of those balances. So that continues to be fairly consistent. Next slide, please. So other operating budget drivers. So materials and supplies, as I said, certainly some increases there around coming back to some of our pre-pandemic service levels. Our utility costs. So we have estimated about a 2.5% increase on average for our utility costs. We also have about $250,000 of new utility costs for some of our new facilities. So our new fleet maintenance garage, the fire fleet garage, the Kingston East Community Center. So you'll hear that in some of the commissioner presentations. And so that certainly is new utilities added on. And then we have about what I would call about $400,000 of utility costs that I would call pre-pandemic levels. And going back and looking actually at what we presented to council at this time last year, actually, I guess it was in January earlier this year, when we presented the 2021 budget, we actually had about $400,000 that we had reduced the budget for utilities. So the majority of that is coming back online and included in the 2022 operating budget estimate. I do want to talk a little bit too about the gas and diesel fuels. We did reduce some of our fuel costs last year by about $250,000. Our fuel this year is actually staying fairly consistent. And council will recall when we did the third quarter operating report, we are projecting about $500,000 in fuel savings by the end of 2021. The majority of that is coming from our transit volume. So we did over budget in terms of our transit volume for 2021. And so we've kept that volume fairly consistent going into 2022. So that has not created any increase for our 2022, particularly for transit. The other thing that we are seeing, a couple other things actually, our regular gas. So transit uses diesel, but our regular gas, mostly for our public works vehicles, we were over budget and expect to be over budget by the end of the year with respect to price for regular gas. And that's not a surprise when we see some of the pump prices today. The other thing that is affecting this, though, is you will recall that our director of asset management and fleet had entered into last year a fuel hedging contract. And certainly with the prices going up in the last few months, we are on the right side of that contract. So that has really helped us in terms of getting some credit back. And this is for our diesel fuel for transit. So we are paying a much lower rate for diesel fuel than what you're seeing at the pumps today. So that has also helped to maintain our prices at the lower levels. So the increase that we're seeing for fuel this year, which is about a couple $100,000, in addition to a little bit of volume increase for our transit service expansion in the fall, the majority of that is really just building in a federal carbon tax increase that we're expecting, as well as about a 2 to 3% inflationary adjustment for those. There is a little bit of risk here with respect to where these prices are going to go, and we have built in some projections that hopefully they won't stay at these higher rates. But we certainly have for our diesel, we do have the hedging contracts that will continue into 2022. The only other thing I wanted to mention that you will see in here in the revenue and expenditures is our red light camera program. And so that certainly has increased the cost here. It's a new cost that would fall into this materials and supplies category of about $200,000. On the contracted service side, which you'll see is going up about $2.6 million. On contracted services, we have about, sorry, I'm just getting down on my slide here, transitioning to our pre-pandemic service levels. About 1.1 million of that relates to bringing costs back online to help support some of the increased services that will be coming back. We've got about almost $300,000 of that relates to our recreational programming and contracted services for program instructors and special events and that kind of thing. About 500,000 with respect to artist fees for our cultural performances, and probably about another 350 for our airport services for ground handling and security. So in total, about 1.1 million of that that's coming back online. And just in comparison, we actually had pulled out last year about $1 million of direct service cost related to our contracted services. The other piece that is in there is we have had some significant price increases with our new solid waste contracts, which you'll hear from Commissioner Joyce later on, about $700,000 that we've had to incorporate into 2022, as well as some maintenance type costs and maintenance services that we have for our new facilities in there, including our Kingston East Community Center. Next slide, please. And then finally, in terms of expenditures, so our grants and transfers to others, you'll see is down here a little bit. Two things that are driving that primarily. We don't have our social services relief funding in 2022 that we had in 2021 budget. So that's about just over $2 million. And as I mentioned earlier, resizing the Ontario Works budget has reduced the transfers here of about 2.2 million. What we do have in this category going forward, we do have an increase in rent support of about $500,000. That has been offset, though, by an increase in some of our provider surpluses that comes back in as revenue. And council may recall, believe it was last year, if not the year before, we started to budget for those surpluses because we found that they were coming back in every year, and they were fairly consistent based on the calculations that are done at year end for these on their annual information returns. We started to build those in last year. I don't think we built a whole lot in because we weren't sure what they were going to look like coming into 2021, but we have included about 390,000 of additional revenues coming back from them for 2022. So that's helping to offset the increase in the investment that we're making in terms of rent supplement support. And then we do have, again, a bit of a right sizing, as well as a couple of agency closures that you'll hear later on some detail from our CAO with respect to our childcare providers and some of the support that's happening there. And then finally, in terms of our transfers to reserve funds, our 1% capital levy is the primary increase here, about $3.1 million that we'll be putting into our capital reserve funds, or a total of about $46.9 million that's now going in on an annual basis to our capital reserve funds. And I'll come back to that when we're looking at in a few minutes at capital. In addition to the 1% capital levy in this category, we do have an increase where we are now transferring the $550,000 from Leon Center contribution back in. We had pulled that out for 2021. That is back in for 2022. And we've had a slight reduction of what's going into our parking reserve fund because we have used about $800,000 of our parking reserve fund transfer to help offset the loss in revenues that we've had to show for parking. So those two basically net out with respect to that category. Next slide, please. So I just want to take a quick look at our multi-year operating forecasts. These numbers are slightly different from what would have been in the binder because we did update for the hospital numbers, which carried over slightly into 2023, 24, and 25. So you can see in terms of the next 3 years, including our capital levy, we have a forecasted tax rate increase of 3.4, 3.2, and 3.1. We've applied a 2.3% tax rate increase to these numbers. Council has approved for 2023 a 2.3% increase, and we've carried that forward and made that assumption for the following 2 years as well. You'll also see that we've applied a 0.16% increase with respect to the Green CIP program that Council just recently approved. That's the $3.7 million program over the next 4 years, which will require an incremental tax increase of approximately 0.16% each year for 4 years, starting in 2023. So a net gap of just under 1% for 2023 and coming down a little bit more in 2024 and 2025. One of the things that is incorporated in here, as I mentioned earlier, is the revenues coming on board. So because our what I would call direct expenditures have come back online quicker than the fees and charges revenues. We're seeing some benefit of that certainly in 2023 and a little bit in 2024 as those revenues come on board with a different proportionate level of direct expenditures. So from a dollar gap, what we're looking at for 2023 at this point, we have a gap of about $2.2 million. Cumulatively, that goes up to about $4 million in 2024. However, if we find sustainable solutions to that 2.2, our gap really is only about additional 1.8 for 2024, and then an additional about 1.7 for 2025. So staff will continue to address these gaps with various solutions around prioritizing initiatives, refining our department plans, looking for efficiencies and other revenue sources, and certainly have our work cut out for us in terms of our projections. Next 2 slides, please. So just moving into our capital budget for 2022, just to remind Council, we do have 3-year capital plans that were approved in 2020 for both engineering and transportation services. So you will not see budget requests for 2022 for those 2 departments. We have done a targeted focus, as we did last year, on our works in progress, certainly as a result of the continued pandemic disruption, some of the delays that we've had in 2020 and continued to experience in 2021. We've done a thorough review of our works in progress to make sure that we do have the capacity to first complete some of those works before we're moving into a 2022 budget request. And so you will see 2022 overall is lower than what we would normally have in what I might call an average year. See certainly the investment in strategic priorities built into the capital budget, and you'll hear more about that as the commissioners are presenting their areas. There's also what I would call an increased investment in our life cycle investment, particularly in facilities. And you'll hear more about that from the commissioner as well. But as we continue with this centralized model that we've talked about the last couple of years with council, and reviewing from an asset management standpoint, planning for some of these existing assets, we have been gradually trying to increase our investment that we're making on an annual basis for facilities. And I think we initially were down around the 10 to 12 mark. We're closer now to the $15, $16 million mark. And I expect as some of our asset management work is currently being done and we see some of the results of that will continue. But we have started to increase that investment. The other piece that we continue to focus on when we're doing our capital budget recommendations is making sure that we are managing our capital spending. Standard & Poor's does look at our net spending balance of capital, and they look at a measure that actually compares it to our total operating revenues. So looking at what that total investment is that's going into capital. And so it's one of those performance indicators that we continue to keep an eye on. Between that and just our capacity to get the work done does tend to impact the balances in terms of what we're recommending. Next slide, please. So the proposed capital budget is just over $70 million for 2022. You can see almost 60 million of that coming from our reserve funds, or what we call pay as you go, and another just over 10 million coming from government grants. Again, no issuance of long-term debt in this budget. As the last budget year for this council term, we have not had any approved debt that's been recommended in this council term. Council will recall we've actually issued some debt that had already been approved. We did have a debt issuance, it was last year, but there's been no new debt added to the debt numbers, and you'll see that in a moment when I look at take a look at the debt slide. So $70 million budget request overall. Next slide, please. So in terms of our proposed capital expenditures, I did just break down the 70 so you get a bit of a feel for what's in there just from a functional standpoint. We do have what I would categorize under council's strategic priorities. We've got money for affordable housing, energy management and retrofits under some of our climate action initiatives, some investment in our transit, which does relate directly to some of the ISIP funds that we've received, and some employment land acquisition and servicing, and which council has recently been discussing. As I said, we have tried to start to increase some of our investment in our asset management and life cycle requirements. Facilities actually up close, I said 16 million, it's actually closer to $17 million. Within that, we do have some fairly large projects that you will hear about later tonight. Certainly some investment in City Hall, our county courthouse, Rideau Crest, as well as 610 Montreal, which is related to a potential grant. We have our normal fleet replacements, including our bus replacements, of about $15 million. We have included electrification costs within the budget for transit buses for the next couple of years. You'll also note in our 15-year plan, we have included electrification within the plan, but subsequent to 2023, it's not funded. So it does show as unfunded at this point, but it is included within the plan. One of the reasons that we did that, besides knowing that it's a council priority, is it's useful to sometimes have some of those things in the plan for grant purposes. So when we're applying for grants, quite often provincial and federal grants will look for incremental initiatives that haven't already been funded. And so it's quite often useful in terms of doing those grant applications to know that those they're in the plans, but there is not municipal funding currently for them. And then we've got about $5 million in IS&T, about $50 million in equipment, and other more specific functional capital type things that we would have by department. And then finally, about $3 million related to agency budgets for Kingston Access Bus, police, and for library, which you heard about last night. It's interesting just to look and see when you look at the asset management and life cycle numbers that I have on the screen there, total is about $50 million. If you add in, say, another, on average, we spend maybe 10 million a year for parks, which is under the three-year approval, as well as our roads and bridges and transportation, which is probably another, say, 30 to $40 million, we're up to around the $100 million mark, which is what we normally project for our asset management. Some of the work that Director Fowler is doing around some of the asset management planning, we're anxiously awaiting to see what some of those results are that are coming back, and looking to fine tune what those life cycle investments maybe need to be. I expect probably our numbers are going to be a bit low, but certainly in anticipation of that, we have started to try to build into some of the 15-year projections, some of those numbers, knowing that we are going to see them go up. Next slide, please. I won't spend long on this debt slide. As I said, there's no new debt being recommended in the capital budget for 2022. And so council has recently seen these numbers when we provided the annual debt repayments limit report earlier this year. You can see that we've got about 500, and at the end of 2020, about $520 million of debt, split out by tax support and utility rates and user charges. We're estimating about $35 million will be paid off in principal between 2021 and 2022. And so we are projecting being down about $485 million by the end of 2022. We are continuing to monitor, as I said earlier, the interest rates to determine when might be the right time to be issuing the rest of the debt that's been approved by council but not yet issued. You can see there is about $136 million. And we're also obviously continuing to monitor our debt levels with respect to some of the measures that Standard & Poor's continues to look at as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of that $136 million that's been approved but not yet issued, you can see here, I've just provided a listing of the projects that includes. Certainly the two big ones being the Cataraqui Bay wastewater plant of $78 million that will be issued fairly shortly, as well as the $30 million from Third Crossing. And we're certainly taking a look now at the timing of that and when it might be appropriate to look at issuing those. And then a few of our other projects as well that are included in there. What I would like to point out here, which is very interesting, and I didn't take time to go back and look at a council presentation, maybe even 8 or 9 or 10 years ago, in terms of the debt that had not been yet issued. I would say there's only 2 lines on here that I would call more life cycle related. So the pathways and trails and the roads and related. So the debt strategy that we've been working on since almost shortly after amalgamation was really about using our debt to get us to address the infrastructure deficit and get us back up to a level that we needed to be with respect to investment in our assets. And then to use that debt as well for any of our new projects, so our growth type projects, which is what you would normally use debt for. So you can see here, as we sort of slowly move to that more of a pay-as-you-go for what would be our asset replacement and life cycle costs, and trying to only utilize debt for our new growth type projects. And so except for maybe about $9.5 million here, which I would still continue to call asset management costs, the remainder of this really is more growth related projects. So we're very close to where we wanted to be in terms of that I guess about 20-year strategy that we were using. Next slide, please. So just to show this in terms of the graph, so we do have our projected debt balances here going out to 2036. Council's very familiar with this now, that the green line, which is our self-imposed target with respect to debt, and you can see that we are continuing to stay below that line, certainly not having any new debt being recommended within this term of council has helped us to do that. And then the red line, as you know, is the provincial debt repayment limit line, and the amount that we would be allowed to have under the provincial measures, that we would never want to be that far above that. So this has incorporated in issuing that 136 million within the next 2 or 3 years, as well as some planned debt in the out years in our 15-year capital plans that's also built into here. But you can see that we continue to have less reliance on debt overall as we're going into the out years. Next 2 slides, please. So I'm just going to finish up with a couple of department presentations so that you don't have to listen to me again tonight. So I just wanted to visit the capital levy in our fiscal services budgets, which are included in the corporate tab of the budget binder. So you will see the capital levy in fiscal services itself has gone up about $5 million. Included in this is the 1% capital levy, which was about 3.1 million within that. And I think I'm just trying to look now, 16.7 million from our fees and charges transfers as well is included in that. The other things within the fiscal services, I don't think I mentioned in the fees and charges, we have reduced our POA revenues, and you'll hear more about that through the corporate services. We have a reduction of about 300,000 our POA revenues. We had reduced our POA revenues initially for pandemic impacts, but again, we have gone back and looked historically, and we are seeing overall that we have been a little too aggressive in terms of some of our estimates of the POA. And we have been short. And so we have actually done some right sizing of that by reducing that down by about $300,000. That net revenue from the POA operations, which runs through legal, the legal services department, the net revenue actually comes in here through fiscal services. And so that has been dropped down as well. The other thing is we did have our Safe Restart funding was showing up in this fiscal services amount for the $1.4 million. So that plus the 3.1 of the capital levy really addresses that change in our capital levy and fiscal services. In the tax assistance and adjustments, things have been fairly status quo for 2022 budget, particularly because there is no change in the assessment. So things are going to stay fairly consistent. However, we have actually reduced our tax write-offs by about $500,000 in 2022. Council may recall we actually bumped it up in 2021 because we had a couple of large appeals underway, particularly for some of the larger outdoor malls. And as those are getting settled, we now reduced that back down to a more normal level for 2022. On 2 more slides over. So just in terms of the financial services budget, as well as mayor and council budgets. So you will see for financial services actually has gone down just slightly in terms of their budget. Financial services actually has a couple of large projects that are going to be happening in 2022. I think council's probably heard the last couple of years about a planned upgrade to our financial management system. Taking it to a cloud-based version, Dynamics 365. It's a fairly large upgrade. I think we told council last year we were really was going to happen in 2021, and unfortunately, with other things happening, we just weren't able to move forward with that. We will be moving forward with that in 2022. We actually have a timeline with respect to support ending by the somewhere around the end of 2022 or early 2023, and so we do need to get going on this. So it will be a priority for financial services and for some of the departments as well in terms of some of the changes that will be happening to the system in 2022. We actually have an RFP out right now for a professional services partner to help us with that migration, and that RFP will be closing on December 10th. So we will be off and running in the new year with that. The other project that I believe we did talk about last year is a replacement of our point of sale system. And again, we are up against some support timelines. We keep borrowing a little bit of time every year and able to carry on, but we do know that the support is going to stop on our current POS system. And so we are taking that opportunity to take a step back and really look at our whole payment process, both in person as well as online, looking at some of the best practice and the ability maybe to find some efficiencies and to create some consistency across the various types of payments and the various locations and the payment methods, and try to integrate that a little bit better. We actually do have a grant application out right now for doing a review of our complete payment processes, both online and in person. And some of that we're hoping, if we get that grant and get that work done, will help to inform some of what we'd be moving forward with the point of sale system. So it may not be completely implemented by 2022, but certainly will be have that design and planning stage done. And then finally, the other thing I want to mention just with respect to financial services is some of the work that we are doing in procurement. So we are looking to advance our updated procurement bylaw in the new year with council. We will be coming back with that. We're also looking at continuing to expand more of a centralized function within procurement that will not only support the bylaw, but also play a little bit more of a role around review and approval and compliance of those rules within the bylaw. And then we'll also be looking to integrate some of our sustainable and social procurement principles that are included as principles in the new bylaw, but looking to implement what that means with respect to our policy and our processes around procurement. With respect to mayor and council, just to comment on that one, that does reflect the CPI adjustment for salaries and benefits for 2022, which is based on I believe it was the October 1 or September 30th measure. And we have left, you'll recall last year we did reduce some of the conference and travel balances that are in the budget for each council member. We've maintained those at the reduced levels for 2022, anticipating that there will be less travel in 2022, and we will revisit that again coming forward into 2023 as we see where things are happening with respect to that. And I think that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Kennedy. So at this point, we'll pause and open up the floor for questions. Again, we'll have the more detailed specific departmental presentations tonight and tomorrow, but any high-level questions based on the budget presentation from Ms. Kennedy? Councillor Carter.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson. Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Very thorough, very accurate to hear of lots of good news stories, including the growth and assessment. And that's what I want to ask about. If/when MPAC reassesses properties in town, will that be included in the assessment growth, or are they separate entirely? And I ask, I'll give you the reason why. A resident in my district, they had the bank in to assess their place. They said it was going to be like 3 times what the MPAC letter that came this year said. So it seems like we're much behind, and I just want to know how that all fits together.
Thank you. Thank you for that question through you, Mr. Mayor. Excellent question, Councillor Colley, and I get asked that a lot. So I think, first of all, to say in terms of what we're anticipating and some of, I think, what the province is trying to do from some of the discussions I've had with the province, with Ministry of Finance and with MPAC, I think one of the reasons that they're trying to push it out is to try to get what I would call sort of pandemic-related adjustments behind us so that they're not affecting the assessment. So I think that's one of the things that they are struggling with, is how to do that. But I think more to your question, particularly as we're going to be like 9 years old in terms of the valuations. So what will happen is, and maybe I just use an example, if everybody's assessment went up, let's say 10% as an easy number. If everybody's goes up 10%, then what happens from a municipal standpoint is our tax rate goes down 10%. So we don't raise any more money because that assessment's gone up. The only time we raise more money is when we have new assessment growth that comes on. But if my house goes up 20% and yours didn't go up at all to get to our average of 10, that's where you'll see the shifts. So the rate would come down 10%, but because mine's gone up 20, I am going to see a higher tax bill. The rate goes down 10, but your property went down 0%, you're going to see your taxes come down. So it is that shift between them. What my concern is today, and I think, the longer this goes, I think this outlook could change. But my concern, if they were to do it today, is that I see our residential properties going up more than our commercial properties might be going up, particularly those commercial properties that are based on an income level. Their assessment is based on an income level, and some have been fairly hard hit with the pandemic. And so that means while we might have a 10% average and the rate goes down, we're shifting from those commercial properties to those residential properties. And with residential making up 75% of our properties, that could certainly be a concern for us. I think the longer that goes, there might be less of a concern there, but that's still very much up in the air in terms of what the province is going to do with that overall. But certainly can say at the end of the day, except for some shifts back and forth, depending on particularly the property class that you're in, it won't affect in terms of the total taxes that we collect overall.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just a quick supplemental on the definition of assessment growth, particularly in suburban neighborhoods like I represent. If someone were to put a secondary suite in, would that be considered new assessment growth? Or because it's in the same dwelling, is it just become a wash?
Technically, it should be new growth. It's all based on market value. So presumably, if you have one house that doesn't have the secondary suite and the house next door is exactly the same, except it has a secondary suite, presumably that house with the secondary suite could get a higher sale price for that property. Having said that, and I'll stand corrected, I know my tax manager, Jeff Walker, is at the meeting here tonight, but what we have been seeing is that it really hasn't been making a whole lot of change. So practically speaking, I would expect it would. What we are seeing is there hasn't been a huge change to date anyway, with respect to increased assessments for that.
Thank you so much.
Next is Councillor Neal.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. As always, very thorough introduction to the budget. I was a little curious at first when I saw the 4.5 increase related to mayor and council, because as you pointed out, there's been very little travel, very few of us have been able to go to conferences, and our salaries have only modestly been increased. But council was interviewed earlier in the year about the possibility of it having some support given to councillors. Is any of that potential for 2022 reflected in the 4.5%? Oh, I see Lanny's here. So, but
and through Mr. Mayor, so we anticipated this question, Councillor Neal. That's something actually that will be in the clerk's department presentation. So this particular budget would not include that portion in terms of the council support. That will be covered under the clerk's presentation.
okay, thank you.
Okay, Deputy Mayor Ostroff.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Patterson, and really appreciate the financial report, Ms. Kennedy. Awesome, as we all have heard all along. You mentioned the land acquisition and servicing funding, and I just wanted clarification because my understanding is that there's money in the bank already for that from purchases, because that's how it works. We understand that land is purchased and it pays for the infrastructure and the development and preparation of the land. So can you explain what that allowance is for there then? Or does it just flow through?
Yes, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Oosterhoff. Yeah, that's a great question through you, Mr. Mayor. So yes, it does really flow through. So we try to, what we normally do is we fund it from, we have an industrial land reserve fund. And so we do actually what I would call temporarily fund those costs from that industrial land reserve fund. And when we have land sales, that revenue goes back into that reserve fund. So from a cash flow standpoint, we kind of borrow from the industrial land reserve fund, and that's how we track money's going out and money's coming back in from sales. But at the end of the day, from a reporting, it's an inventory on our balance sheet, and you're correct. We just increase the value of that land for the servicing and the investment in it. And then that comes off, and we actually recognize a gain, hopefully not a loss, but a gain on our financial statements, just like a profit company would do in terms of reporting that. So, but you're correct. It is really just a cash flow in and out. But you will see it's actually looks like it's funded in the reserve funds from the industrial reserve fund model. And I see Commissioner Hugenboss might have more to add there.
No, I'm good, Mr. Mayor. Sorry, Ms. Kennedy did a great job. Sorry.
The other question, Mayor Patterson, if I may, was related to transit expansion. And just to clarify, a rural resident asked me the other day about that, and I don't. That's not part of our tax base there. Increase in transit costs. It doesn't affect the rural taxpayers, right?
No, transit is part of our tax base. It is included in our tax base, the net tax, net transit costs.
Ridership supported. I thought it was a ridership supported.
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Mayor. So there is a fees and charges component to it, but it's not 100% funded from fees and charges. So there is a net taxation impact that goes to the bottom line for all taxpayers.
Okay. I'll ask more questions about that later. The other question was, and maybe I missed it, I apologize. The public input, how helpful was that as we saw the signage and the work for that? And if I missed something, I apologize, but how helpful was that to you and your team?
Yes, thank you, Deputy Mayor. It's that's a great question. I think it was more helpful maybe this year than it was last year. I think that the challenge is to try to get that input down to a level of detail that we can actually then incorporate into the budget, because budget is such a broad category. As you realize, it takes me an hour to get through all of it on budget night. So it's a broad category. But having said that, what we did this year is we asked some repeat questions on the survey of folks. And what we saw at the end of the day was that people were supportive of council's priorities. So things like affordable housing and climate change, green spaces, they were very supportive of those. So I think it wasn't a surprise what we saw. And I think it showed that our budgets were on the right track with respect to that. We did try to zoom in a little bit more this year on specific areas. So we kind of picked some departments and a couple of agencies, and we did open houses very specific to those rather than more general, hoping to maybe get a little bit more input on those specific services and be able to provide the departments with some more input, with some feedback that we were getting. I would say that didn't work as well. It still stayed fairly general. It wasn't a great turnout, to be honest, and I don't know, maybe maybe we didn't pick the right departments or the right agencies, but that piece didn't work out as well. But certainly I think it was sort of a good confirmation for us, some of the survey results that we were receiving back. The other piece that we did get back, we did ask a specific question on, give us some ideas as what ideas do you have of where we could do things better, or where we could maybe find some efficiencies. And we kind of left that as an open-ended question. And we did get some really good comments back on that. And our deputy treasurer, Ms. Folds, spent a lot of time sorting through, doing them by department and by agency. And we were able to provide those to the departments, not necessarily to impact the 2022 budget, but perhaps future budgets and even just the way that they're doing things. So those have been provided. And I'm trying to think now, I know there was something certainly around technology and use of technology and being more efficient in some of the operations. So there were a few good points like that that we received that hopefully will be of use for the departments.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question regarding page 10 on taxation. A couple of questions, actually. The one is the tax assistance program, so it's $745,000 approximately. Could you explain a bit more about that? Like, how many households are assisted in that way? I thought most of it, well, we do deferrals, I know that too. So this is clearly an expenditure, or at least appears to be an expenditure. So I'm just wondering how that works.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. I'm actually going to ask Mr. Walker to address that question. He would have a little more of the detail of that particular budget line. And I think he's here.
Mr. Walker.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. A large portion of the tax assistance programs that are in the budget have to do with the charity rebate program. That number in the budget would be about 100,000 of the 745,000. And then most of the remainder of it would be the elderly citizens write-off, the $100 that goes off of the tax bill of elderly citizens receiving the guaranteed income supplement. That's about 175,000. And the remainder of that budget is for the brownfield tax cancellation programs.
Oh, the brownfield tax cancellation?
Correct.
Can you just give us a bit more information on that, please?
Yes, that's when there's, through the brownfields program, during the remediation period where we cancel the tax bill for qualifying properties until the property is built and goes into the tax incremental grant program.
So write-offs.
Correct.
Right. So do we allow, I looked at this a few years ago, it turned out we were ahead of the places I was looking at, so I gave it up. Especially in regard to seniors. So do we allow people to accumulate their taxes such that they're paid on the sale of the residence?
We have two deferral programs through you, Mr. Mayor, sorry. We have deferral programs in place. We have program where a resident can defer up to $1,000 of their taxes on a yearly basis. We also have a tax increase deferral program. Both of those can stay on the property until the property is transferred ownership.
Right, okay. And do we have much take up on that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, neither program has seen a abundance of take up, I would say.
Okay. So, but people could afford themselves. Okay. I guess it's always important to know that's there. Okay. The other question I have is regards the line here, the brownfield SIP allocations, in which in 2022 it indicates the payments. I take it these are tax rebates numbers, and correct me if I'm wrong, of 1.325 million. And I'm less concerned about that. Then in 2023, it goes to 1.825 million. And then it jumps up to 3.125 million. And then again, by another $325,000 a year after that. So do we know how high this is going to go? Since in 4 years, it'll be 3.45 million.
So thank you, Councillor Hutchison, through you, Mr. Mayor. So yes, so we have a number of properties, and I'll let Jeff add to this because he'll have more of the detail on the properties. But as these properties are coming on, and they have up to a 10-year repayment of the brownfields costs, so we do keep schedules on them. I believe by the time we hit 2025, we are building up to incorporate projected repayments for the Davis Tannery property. So it will continue to go up for that property. And I think when that was before council, there was some discussion about it, being at this point, it's very much projection, but that would use up a lot of our brownfield envelope with respect to that, because it's a large project. Now it is happening over a number of years, and it's happening in 4 different phases. But what we are trying to do by 2024 is start to build up to that. However, there are some other ones I believe that are in there, and I think Jeff, you might be able to help between sort of now and then what's driving that balance up.
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. Treasurer is absolutely correct. It's mostly, by the time we get to the top, it's to do with the Davis Tannery project. There are, however, a couple other large projects that are projected to be in those totals by that time, such as the North Block multi-residential properties that are projected to be in there that are approved brownfield, and the property up at Gardeners Road, 700 Gardeners Road, that's approved brownfield project, or some of the other large ones that are in those figures around that time.
Right. So at our last planning meeting, a citizen pointed out that that in SIP document section 2.4, page 3, it says the ability of the city to continue financing brownfield tax rebates at current levels while achieving its 1% tax assessment growth target was identified as a concern. Could you please explain to me in more detail what is involved there? The way I take it is that 1% is about 2.5 million, roughly, and then growing slowly. And so by year 2024, we're in excess of that by a fair bit, actually, by a third, by $1 million. So what is the effect? How is this working?
So thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. So you raise a good point, Councillor Hutchison, because and we've had some conversations about this with Commissioner Agnew and with Mr. Walker and I. So we have the brownfield projections in based on the models that we maintain, and using projections for what we think the assessment's going to be, which dictates the repayment process, and the timing of construction, timing of when it's occupied and assessed. And so there's a lot of variables that go into that. But and so we include what those projections are, and we have some fairly good numbers behind them. on the growth side, by the time we're getting out to say 2024, 2025, you're correct. We usually project about 1% for our growth because we just don't know what things are going to look like. And so we're not being consistent necessarily in our outer year projections, particularly when we start talking about a development like the Davis Tannery. So, and I think this is, and I know we're waiting for some of the updated population housing study numbers that'll be coming in the next couple of years to revisit some of this. But when you have a project that large, is that just covering off your 1% or say $2.5 million of growth? Or is there actually going to be more growth than that, which we have not included in the estimates? So we have the expense side, but we may potentially not have the other side of it. So we're being very conservative. So I'm not familiar with the planning report that you're talking about, and I don't know, Commissioner Agnew may have more comment on that. But that's certainly discussion that we have been having, is if we're including, and as we go past 2024, 2025, those brownfield numbers will be going up, but potentially the growth numbers as well will be going up.
And when you say growth numbers, you mean the 1% levy will be increasing?
Yes,
Right.
correct.
But not at those rates, not at the rates of the growth of these brownfields expenditures or rebates, I should call them.
Yeah, and I don't think there's an intention that they would necessarily offset. Because you've got a number of projects that are overlapping, and those repayment periods are up to 10 years. So it wouldn't necessarily be that they would be offsetting for those.
Right. Well, there's two things about that. One is that they, the phases on the tannery, for example, never mind the other parts that Mr. Walker pointed out, are overlapping. Like they build one, and then we start, a year after it's built, we start paying it out, and then another one is built within the 10-year period. So have we accounted for that?
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, we have. We have accounted for that in our models. Yep. And
Okay.
I believe we have it coming on about every 2 years. We have that next phase coming on in those models.
Okay. I'm not sure it's that fast, but okay. Okay, just a point of concern. I'll leave it at that. We can come back to these, Mr. Mayor, at some other point, right?
Yeah, I would prefer that, to be honest. No,
Okay.
too far into the weeds on one particular project.
Sure.
But, any other questions, Councillor Chappelle?
Thank you, Your Worship. Ms. Kennedy, I appreciate the time you take to put this together with all of the information. I have two questions from a risk management perspective. One, what is our plan if interest rates suddenly start bumping? I've been reading about how the Bank of Canada is looking to possibly raise interest rates as many as 5 times over the next 18 months. And so what is our plan to mitigate that? And then the second question is, what is our plan to mitigate the federal government's potential plan to reduce the payments in lieu of taxes? And how would that impact Kingston? What will we do if we suddenly have, say, $5 million reduced in our budget because they choose to reduce the amount that they're going to pay the city in lieu of taxes?
Thank you, Councillor Chappelle, for those questions. Through you, Mr. Mayor. So with respect to the interest rate, and I've been doing some research the last 2 or 3 weeks on rates, and I saw the same thing, Councillor Chappelle. I think I saw up to 6 times. They could potentially over the 18 months 6 times increase. So basically 1.5% on that policy rate that the Bank of Canada could do. And so we're doing a couple of things. So you saw this slide with $136 million of projects. So we are keeping a very close eye on these rates and what might happen. My deputy treasurer is in contact with Infrastructure Ontario and where the rates are going and what they're doing. So we are, as things change, we're catching it very, very quickly. I don't anticipate they would jump up all at once. I think it would be sort of 0.25% increases, say over that 18 months, as you suggested. So there's a couple of things that we can do. We have had discussions with Infrastructure Ontario on the ability to basically pre-issue our debt. So normally we would not issue debt until the project is well completed. We know exactly what the costs are going to be. Sometimes even the holdback, we wait until some of the holdback and the warranty period, because our construction rate with IO is pretty cheap. I think it's like 0.67% the other day that we pay on that. So we're not in a real hurry necessarily to do that. But we do have the opportunity, if we saw that rates were going to go up and the project wasn't done, Infrastructure Ontario will allow us to do some estimates on potentially what that total debt amount is going to be, and basically pre-issue the debt. And I know in the past we've done that once before a few years ago, and we had sort of an agreement where we just continued to pay interest until the project was done. But if cash flow allow, we can even start to be repaying it right away. So that is not necessarily something that all municipalities are allowed to do, but because of our credit rating, IO has in writing told us that they are quite comfortable in having those conversations with us. So I think that would be the first thing that we would do is particularly on the larger ones, we would issue them fairly quickly if we saw the rates were going to go back. The other thing we do is we actually build in a little bit higher rate for our debt that has been approved but not yet issued in our models. We include higher interest rates on those. So we've got a little bit of a buffer. Doesn't help if we then end up having to pay it. At least in our models, it won't affect us in terms of our affordability. It would go up. We've got that covered. PILs, federal government PILs. So you're correct. We are at their mercy. It's a little frustrating. And as council is aware, we have an ongoing lobbying going on with the federal government right now with respect to the PILs, because when the province reduced the business education tax for 2021 and onwards, that affected municipalities because we get to keep the business education piece of the federal grants in lieu. It doesn't go on to the school board. So for Kingston, when the province did that, and they did that as a way to help businesses recovering from the pandemic. So a bit of an unintended consequence, but for us, it was a hit of about $1.2 million. That is actually built into our budget. So our PILs for 2021 and again for 2022 are $1.2 million less. So we actually have been able to absorb that within our budget models. But there has been certainly the mayor of Ottawa, I know, had a meeting with our mayor and some of the other municipalities that affected. There's only really about half a dozen municipalities that it significantly affects, Ottawa, I think, being the biggest one. And I know there was a meeting and there has been correspondence back and forth with both the province and the federal government. The challenge is that the province and the feds are dealing with separate legislation. So technically, they're both following the legislation that they have. They're doing it the right way. The federal legislation says we'll pay the PIL based on what a taxable property would pay. So they have every right to pay $1.2 million less to us. But there certainly has been an argument that this was an unintended consequence. This was not meant to be hurting the municipalities. And so there have been other options put forward to the federal government where they could still follow the legislation, pay the lesser amount, but maybe there was a different avenue that they could compensate the municipalities. I don't know. I haven't heard anything in the last couple of weeks as to what's happened. I do know, I heard sort of a rumor that the two federal ministers did meet last week on this, the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Public work services, I think it's called. But I haven't heard anything back as to what's happened. So it will be certainly a windfall for us because we have incorporated it into our budgets already. So if we do end up getting that $1.2 million back, that will certainly be a benefit for us.
I think maybe I misdirected my question. From what I understand, the federal government is looking to reduce the amount they pay in payment in lieu. This is beyond the provincial implication. They're looking to actually drop, like, for example, Quinte West has Air Force Base Trenton. They're looking at a $1.2 million hit, which is a 2% tax increase for Quinte West. If we have KP, we have RMC, we have a lot more federal lands, and if they drop a similar impact to Trenton, what is our mitigation strategy for Kingston if we get hit in a similar fashion?
So I think what Ms. Kennedy was trying to say is that hit's already happened, and that's already been incorporated into the budget. And so the advocacy that myself and Mayor Watson and others are working on is to try to reverse that. Then that would be additional dollars back that we wouldn't lose after all. Ms. Kennedy, did I get that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you for clarifying. That's all I have for now.
Thank you. Are there any other questions at this point? Ms. Kennedy, I have just a couple of quick questions for you. So the first is on trying to forecast what usage rates will be for transit and for parking and for recreational services. I'm sure that that's a difficult crystal ball exercise at the best of times. So just wondering if you could give us a sense of an estimate of 62% ridership for transit, 90% for parking, 95% for recreation. Are those conservative estimates? Are they optimistic? Is it some attempt to try to thread the needle? Can you give us some sense perhaps of where those usage rates are right now so we can get a sense of how much do we have to improve on those things to be able to hit those budget numbers?
So thank you through you, Mr. Mayor. So, and I may defer some of the details to the commissioners as they're presenting these services. They may have more information, but what I would say is that they are not aggressive. I think I would say, if anything, they're a little more conservative, and certainly based on some of what we are seeing today. So parking, as you know, went down because we are seeing a reduction in that. So I think some of that is based on certainly what we're already starting to see as things open up. But I would say overall, I would think that they're fairly conservative. I think we tried to not create problems for us next year if things started to turn around. Now, having said that, with the pandemic, if we started to have closures or something again, and who knows, then obviously we could have some challenges there. But yeah, we tried not to be too aggressive with them.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully we won't see those challenges. Okay, thank you. And my other question, one of the themes of your presentation is just how critical the growth in the tax base was for this budget. So looking at the impact of new development in the community. So is it fair to say, if you were to bring forward exactly the same budget with all the same spending, without the growth that we'd experience, then is it right to say that the tax rate increase, instead of being 2.1%, would be 4.4%? Is that, can I interpret it that way?
Yes. Thank you through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, that is correct. Without our growth, we would have had a 4.4% tax rate increase. Right.
And so then just a related question. So is it fair to say that Kingston has one of the lowest tax rate increases among comparable cities in the province because we had one of the fastest growth rates?
Yes, that is fair to say, and certainly in the survey and the comparisons that we had at the treasurer's table, that you could see that impacts. So the ones like Kingston that had a lower rate did tend to have a higher growth. So that definitely was impacting where that tax rate was falling overall. So yes, I would say that it's definitely fair to say.
Thank you very much. Okay, if there are no questions, so we've gone through the budget overview, and Ms. Kennedy, you've also gone over the financial services component of the budget. So at this point, I will turn the floor over to Commissioner Joyce from Transportation and Public Works to walk us through the next segment of the departmental budget. Commissioner Joyce.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson, and good evening to everyone. I'll start by noting the departments that actually fall within this group and acknowledge the senior staff that are leading them, who will be on hand this evening to assist me. Go to the next slide, please. So the Transportation and Public Works group actually comprises of a number of departments. Public Works is led by our new director, Karen Santucci. And while I've had a well-seasoned 4 weeks in total in this new role, Karen's actually been in her new role even less. And so for that reason, I'd like to also recognize that we have our Public Works Operations Managers, Troy Studinsky and Kyle Bolton on hand this evening to help out with answering any questions. Our Transportation Services Department's headed up by Director Ian Semple, and I note that Marissa Mascaro, our Manager of Transportation Infrastructure, is with us this evening as well. Transit Services with Director Jeremy DaCosta at the wheel. We have Corporate Asset Management and Fleet Department led by Director Brent Fowler. We have Engineering under the guidance of Director Luke Falwell. Solid Waste, which only in the last few weeks now falls under the umbrella of the Public Works Department. However, for the purposes of the corporate budget, it remains separated out. And we have our acting manager, Jason Hollett, joining us this evening to assist with any questions there. And a new addition to the Transportation and Public Works group as part of the recent corporate realignment, but still part of my team, is Kingston Fire and Rescue, which is commanded by Chief Sean Armstrong. Next slide, please. So the total expenditures for my group is roughly $123.5 million. And with revenues just shy of 20 million, the net impact is 83.5 million. And salaries, wages, and benefits, they represent almost 54% of that total expenditure. Equipment charges and internal allocations account for almost 18%, while our material supplies and fees contribute almost 12%. Contracted services is just below 10%, I think it's around 9.9. And for my groups, then the total operating budget increase is 2.4% over last year, and that equates just less than 2 million on the $83.5 million net budget. So I'll go into what's driving those increases as I go through each department. Next slide, please. So this is a quick overview of the capital request. Again, as our Chief Financial Officer noted, Transportation Engineering Services don't have a capital budget request for 2022 because you as council had approved a multi-year capital program back in 2020 for 2020 to 2022. So the total ask is just a sliver past the $23 million mark. For Transportation and Public Works capital budget. Now let me go through each department. Next slide, please. So starting with Public Works, the ask here is for 2.7% increase over last year's operating budget. And Public Works, of course, deals with much of the stuff associated with the physical infrastructure that the public uses or enjoy daily, such as our roads, sidewalks, parks, sports fields, trails, green spaces, and forestry. And every day, this department responds to a multitude of issues and often are the staff that deal with the stuff that people just aren't quite sure of who to get a hold of or who can handle it. So some key items we will be focusing in on next year are ensuring that all minimum maintenance standards are being met. We're going to look at improving the service levels and optimizing our resources for the parks and sports fields. We want to develop and implement a multi-year forestry operating plan, and we're hoping to bring that back in early fall. It's the last year of the neighborhood tree program, so we will have 1,800 trees for residents to plant in 2022. But quite frankly, with the success of that initiative, we're really going to be looking to continue this program in following years as well. Also, we're going to complete the original wildflower planting pilot program. But even though that's supposed to wrap up, we're going to be reevaluating some of the locational considerations with the intention as well to continue that program in future years. And we'll expand the Clean Neighborhoods program, and we're going to try to improve the cleanliness of the downtown area. And an example of that is just more frequent pressure washing. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the public works operating budget is nearly 25 million, and the expenses are increasing 3.1%. And that's being driven by our winter control contracted services for 2022. That's gone up 10%, adding 166,000 to those costs. Also, our allocated equipment expenses are up 4.8%, and that's a $262,000 hit that's associated with fuel and oils costs. The allocated insurance up 8.7%, you heard about. So that's an additional 67,000. And sports fields expenses are actually up 3.4%, but setting the user fee revenues back at normal levels, nets a 4% decrease. And that leads to an overall net expenditure increase for all public works of 2.7%. Next slide, please. With respect to Public Works capital program, the current works in progress is at about 2.8 million, and much of that's going to roll into 2022 with the additional capital asks. The capital request is 2.4 million for things such as pavement markings. We're looking for about 810,000 there, and there's just around 465, I think 450 in WIP. 725,000 for turtle fencing for the St. Lawrence Ave Highway 2 by the Marina and Abidan area. Forestry, we're asking for additional 550,000, and we've got around 780 in WIP right now. Sports fields and parks, 145,000, and there's about 75,000 in WIP. And low volume road improvements, 100,000, and there's about 75,000 WIP currently. Next slide, please. For transportation services, the proposed operating budget is just under 3.2 million, and that's less than 0.5% increase over this current year. Some of the key highlights include implementation of the traffic calming at 12 locations, and that's likely going to occur in the spring. We've got to perform a study to determine locations for additional pedestrian crossings for council to approve. We want to develop an updated on-street patio guidelines and support the DVIA to implement that. We're going to perform analysis on automated speed enforcement, so AKA that's the photo radar with recommendations for locations. And of course, as you heard, we're going to be implementing the red light camera program in 2022. Next slide, please. So expenses are increasing by 12.5%. So that's 461,000. But that's primarily the new costs that are associated with that red light camera program, and it has matching revenues. So if we were to exclude that, expenses are actually up 2.8%. The red light camera program also accounts for increases that are in our contracted services. It shows up 23%, and in material supplies and fees up almost 27%. So with the red light camera offsetting revenues of 357,000 and some cost recovery through normal fees, the net expenditure for the department drops to 0.5% over this current year. Again, 3-year capital program was approved in 2020, so there isn't a capital request for next year, but I will touch on that just a little bit more when I get to the engineering discussion. Next slide, please. The transit proposed operating budget is now at just over 18 million, and that represents an increase of 2.4% from 2021. And this budget is based on a return to pre-pandemic service levels, as Ms. Kennedy noted. Other highlights to note are the last fare increase was in 2020, and there's no increase contemplated for next year, and it's not, we'll take a look at that in 2023. There is an expanded service, as was noted earlier, and that's to the Woodhaven area, and that's planned for September of next year. We are expecting continuation throughout the year of the Safe Restart Agreement funding for transit, which is good news. We plan to launch the new fare payment system and begin installation of the 16 new transit stations. And finally, there's some route modeling work that needs to be completed, as well as development of the implementation plan for transitioning to an electric transit fleet. So currently, I know there's some questions. Currently, we're running, I believe, around a 50% ridership level, and it's expected that that's going to increase. And Director DaCosta may have more information on this later, but I think we're expecting to sort of ramp up to a full ridership or close to full ridership sometime in the spring. Next slide, please. So looking at the operating budget, expenses are up by 7.3%, and that's due primarily to that resumption of full service levels and the expanded service area. Obviously, that increases the overall driver hours, so your salaries, wages, benefits all go up. And as the ridership increases, we have things like merchant fees that go up, and we're also going to bring our marketing activity back up to the normal level. So that's goes from 50,000 up to 75,000, for example. So overall, our net expenditures come in at 2.4%, and that's a result of the associated increased ridership revenue and the provincial subsidies. Next slide, please. Looking at the works in progress as part of the capital, there's 7.2 million. The fare payment system is about 1.5 million. There's partial funding of the new transit station, so to the tune of about 2.6 million. The electrification studies, $250,000. The transit site and building expansion is $750,000. We've got driver protection barriers that are going to be put in place on the buses, and that's about 674,000. And there's actually just over $1 million that's going to be returned to reserves as some projects close out. The new 2022 capital ask is 3.5 million, and that includes further funding to the tune of 1.7 million for those new transit stations, and just under 1.6 million for the new fare box system. And then we have 150,000 to improve our park and ride facilities. Next slide, please. Now moving to corporate asset management and the fleet department. And so this department actually operates as a net zero cost center because all the costs are allocated out to the various departmental operating budgets. So the key things this department will be doing though in 2022 include finalizing the corporate asset management framework that Ms. Kennedy was referring to earlier, that really analyzes how we're managing our entire corporate assets. Updating our green fleet and vehicle operating policies. We're looking to increase our partnerships with other city agencies to manage more of their fleet assets. We are also seeking to improve efficiencies through a fleet asset utilization analysis and a shared vehicle sort of pooling program. And finally, we're expanding upon the existing partnership that we have with Enterprise Fleet Management on vehicle acquisition and financing strategies for our light duty assets. Next slide, please. So although this is a net zero cost center, it's still prudent to discuss the expenses, and I didn't want to get off that easy on this. So if we exclude the revenue from our the internal allocations, expenses are actually increasing by 2.5%, but that's actually being driven by other allocated costs, however, through insurance and accommodation. So the net expenditures remain, of course, at zero for this department. Next slide, please. As for the capital side of things, we have 5.2 million in WIP, but most of that is for 2021 orders that still yet to come in. The 2022 capital ask is primarily fleet and equipment replacement. So we have transit 6.8 million, and the bulk of that is for 5 electric buses. Public Works 3.8 million, other city departments is 2 million. Utilities Kingston is 1.2 million, And then we have some various items, miscellaneous that are around 300,000, technology, comms, and corporate asset management stuff. Next slide, please. For engineering services, the operational budget ask is a $16,000 increase or 2% over 2021. So this group's responsible for a large and very active capital program, and they'll be ensuring that those capital works move forward, including those funded through the DMAP and ISIP programs. Some other key highlights are to strengthen our stormwater management services as part of the development review process, and to finalize the asset management practices and plans that we have for roads, bridges, and stormwater infrastructure, which are pretty major infrastructure systems. Next slide. So expenses are actually up 2% for this department, and that's predominantly a result of increasing the work week of our surveyor inspectors to a 40-hour work week from 35 hours for alignment. And we've actually reduced contracted services by 33%, so 24,000, and with no revenues for this department, our net expenditures end up at the same 2%. Next slide, please. So everything in capital related is in WIP because of the multi-year budget. It was a 3-year capital plan approved starting in 2020. So there's a significant amount that's in work in progress, about 111 million. Now, of those infrastructure projects, 45 million is actually slated for roads, bridges, and culverts. We've got 43 million that's slated for transportation and traffic projects, 18 million for parks, waterfront, and shoreline improvements, 2.5 million for improvements to the stormwater system, and 2.5 million for various other smaller city projects. The details are on the My Neighborhood webpage, and you have access to the list for 2022. And certainly, if there's more details that anyone's looking for, you can let us know, and we can provide further information if you need that and want that. So again, the 2022 capital ask is 0. Next slide, please. So for solid waste, we can get that going. There we are. So although solid waste, as I said, is now part of the Public Works portfolio, that change only just recently occurred, so this budget still has it separated out here. And we have a $348,000 increase in solid waste. And the team is going to continue to promote and explore strategies to achieve Council's target goal of 65% waste diversion by 2025. Currently, we're sitting around 59%, so we still have a bit more to go. As you're aware, things are shifting in this industry, and as governmental regulations change, we'll continue to align our services to those changes, whether they're federally or provincially initiated. Part of that is monitoring and informing Council on the transition to the full producer responsibility for the hazardous or special waste program, as well as the Blue Box program. So the Blue Box program transition to full producer responsibility will on July 1, 2025. And the HSP already transitioned to full producer responsibility on October 1 this year. Now, notwithstanding that, the 2022 budget reflects a status quo operations for both the Blue Box program plan and the hazardous waste depot operations, though some cost savings may be realized depending on the program changes that result from options that are going to be evaluated and proposed to Council. Next slide, please. So our proposed budget has expenses actually up 7.8%, which is primarily caused by the contracted services. And that has a 635,000 hit, which is a 43% increase in the east-west recycling collection costs from our contract that actually started mid this year, 2021. And then we also have we've seen increased tonnage of the leaf yard waste at CART, and that's had an $87,000 impact on contracted services. So the good news is that the net expenditures reduce all that down to 3.5% because the sale price of some of the products like plastics and metals has really improved over this pandemic, providing a material sales increase of $564,000. So we expect that's going to continue through into next year. Also, there's an expected increase in revenues from our garbage bag tags that contributes another $159,000 over what we had in the 2021 budget. Next slide, please. So solid waste capital, there's 1.6 million in WIP. 1.2 million is for completion of the material recycling facility equipment upgrades. There's 143,000 for the Creekford garage building, some improvements needed there. 184,000 for the CART groundwork repair and radios, about 100 and I think for the groundwork repair and around 84 for the radios. So for new capital, though, we're asking for 120,000 to replace the old scale that's at CART, and 60,000 just to make some improvements to the public drop-off points there that are needed. Next slide, please. Last, but certainly not least, with a 26.5 million operating budget is Kingston Fire and Rescue. And the department's seeking a 2.1% increase. And key highlights for next year are we want to finalize the fire services accreditation. So we become one of 9 accredited fire departments in the country. And we're hoping to cement that actually before third quarter of next year. And Council, you received a report on that just recently. We are going to conduct a response time and station location study to see if we can improve overall response time performance. We're going to enhance fire and life safety public education programs, and that's actually based on 2021 stakeholder feedback consultations that were undertaken as part of some of the accreditation work. So we're going to actually move on some of that. And then we're going to replace a very outdated and unsupported records management system to enable better data capture and measurement of some key performance indicators. Next slide, please. So if we look at the operational budget, expenses are up by 2%. And we can see where some of this is coming from. The equipment charges and internal allocations line reflects increases due to repairs and maintenance at multiple fire stations across the city. And it's a $159,000 increase, as well as additional operating and maintenance costs associated with the new maintenance facility, our facility. So that's another $38,000. Contracted services are up 16%, which is about 81,000, and that's due to next generation 911 support, which is an additional 50 grand, and then Motorola support contract. That's another hit about 50,000. But other things, some other contract services came down, so the net effect was around 81,000. The materials and supplies is up 6%, and that's actually due to increased costs for medical supplies and consumables, probably not surprising, such as oxygen and masks during the pandemic. And so our net expenditures end up at 2.1% for Kingston Fire and Rescue. Next slide, please. So looking at the capital program for Kingston Fire and Rescue, in WIP, we have 1.8 million. Around 900,000 of that is for vehicles and equipment replacements and refurbishments. There's 100,000 for furnishing 8 dispatching stations in the comm center. There's 300,000 slated for MG911, and there's 360,000 for software upgrades, customizations for data analytics and reporting. And the 2022 capital ask is $2.7 million, with 1.5 million of that for replacement of response vehicles and 1.1 million for communication related systems, such as 500,000 for the MG911 system, for 543 for the corporate radio system. And that's That's due to the maintenance upgrade support agreement with Motorola, which is 423,000 plus. We now got a cybersecurity module for, and that's 120,000. And 120,000 for dispatching and risk-related software work, and then 50,000 for replacement of some radio associated hardware in the comm center, such as headsets. And next slide, and that completes my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions from council? Councillor Neal.
Yes, a few years ago, Kingston was really the first of all, actually one of only two municipalities that reached the goal of 60% diversion. Now we seem to have stalled at that 60%. And we did have some capital expenditure and some expenditure planned for that was to improve that. And I believe we pulled away from that expenditure last year. I'm just wondering, Mr. Joyce, if some of that new capital we're putting in this year may indeed be able to bump us up closer to the 65. That is our current goal.
Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. I would say that diversion strategy is multifaceted, and in discussions with the solid waste team, there are some strategies that we're going to be looking at to try to get us to that 65%. I'm still confident that is a target that we can reach. Talking with the team, they have some ideas. You know, we still have the school program that got put on hold due to the pandemic. So there are opportunities that are there, Councillor Neal, that I think we'll focus on, and the full intention will be to meet that target.
I look forward to that, and some recommendations coming through EITP to achieve those goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for your presentation. I have two separate questions, but I might as well start with the solid waste one, just keeping on that topic. With the changes coming in the full producer responsibility, I would imagine it would be quite difficult to plan and budget for that. So I'm surprised we're spending money on the scale, for example. Or do you think, how much do we know to actually plan accurately? I think that's the broader question.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, I would say that some of the recent investments at the facility are the bare minimum investments that are needed to keep us moving through. I think there is likely to be some degree of continuation of collection and drop off. It will be coming obviously to council for decision as we look at what options there are for this very changing industry. But we're confident. I mean, you know, even the material recycling facility upgrades were the bare minimum that we could do to continue to operate that facility. And the scale is pretty critical, obviously, for everything that's coming in, because we're still going to have things such as our leaf and yard waste program. So I would just suggest that what we're doing is a cautious approach. It's a prudent approach, and it's a conservative approach. And you know, over the next few months, council and committee will learn more about some of the options that are open to us, and then there'll be opportunity to provide direction at that point. Recommendations we'll provide.
Great, thanks. And another question is regarding the red light camera, the projected revenues. How did you come up with a number of 357,000?
Well, that's a good question. Maybe I'll refer that to our Director Semple of Transportation Services, how they came up with that number.
Mr. Semple.
Thank you for your question, Councillor Doherty. So that revenue is the revenue that's shown in the budget, and the associated costs with that are based on the 7-camera installation that was approved by council earlier this year. You may recall that we were originally targeting 10 cameras and had come back with a modification to that. So that revenue is based on that 7-camera installation with the, the daily per ticket sort of estimate that we had based on that. That estimate comes from our research in other municipalities and in the site level observations that were made at those locations.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Councillor Osanek.
Thank you, Your Worship, through you, and thank you, Commissioner Joyce, for all the information you provided. You have a huge portfolio and one that's like so visible to all the residents in Kingston. So the first one is just for our Director of Transit, and it's just a clarification of the definition where we have in the budget that there's going to be 16 new transit stations. What is a transit station? Is that just like a new bus stop with a shelter over it, or what are we calling a transit station? Thank you.
Mr. DaCosta.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you, and good evening, members of council. Transit station, Councillor Osanek, is a larger shelter, more of a building type structure that is going to be replacing shelters that currently exist at some of our higher usage bus stop locations along our express routes. And we did do an engagement, I think it was earlier this year. And so there's information about that on the engagement site, but it really is to replace existing shelters where our ridership has grown to a point where we need to provide better amenities. In addition to the stations, though, we still have within the capital budget our regular bus shelter installation and replacement program. So we're not only focused on these stations, we will continue to install new shelters, the standard type of shelters, and replacement shelters in accordance with our life cycle replacement plan. So it's both stations and shelters.
I see. Thank you. And I guess these larger shelters that we're calling transit stations, they'll probably be fully loaded. Like they'll also have garbage receptacles, because that's what we're seeing as a factor in a lot of our bus shelters. So they'll have garbage, eh?
Through Your Worship, yes, they will have garbage. There are other amenities as well. At some of the larger stations we're going to build, there will also be covered bicycle parking as well, as we try to integrate the other modes of active transportation. The other thing that we received during the engagement feedback was enhanced lighting. So each of the stations as well will have electricity brought to the site and permanent and more visible lighting to increase passenger comfort and safety.
Neat. And then those 16 stations would be scattered all across the city, I suppose, right? And I think you just said, this is all coming back to me now because we didn't talk about it much at last year's budget meetings because everything was put on a standstill, right? So now I remember from 2019, yes, when you mentioned the bike racks, and they're basically scattered all throughout the city, I suppose, on the express bus routes.
Through Your Worship, that's correct. And I'm happy to follow up with council with a list at another point, just as a reminder. And I think it's important to know as well that although it is 16 under this ISIP approved project envelope, it does not mean that we couldn't build more in future as well if these are viewed as a success. But there are 16 and they are scattered throughout the geography, but along our express routes.
Thank you very much. So that ends my transit questions. Now I have a question for engineering. So before, over the years, we've always done like the road work on, which roads are going to be done like in a 4-year chunk. And then Last year, we did it as yearly, maybe the year before too. And then thank you, Commissioner Joyce, for sending us the 2022 list this afternoon at 2:30. So now we have the nice chart 4-page document that we can send out to people for the 2022 list. Is that sort of how we think we're going to be doing it for next year and thereafter? Because I can kind of see advantages of it rather than a 4-year list at the beginning of every term. I kind of like this 1-year list.
Thank you, and through you, Councillor or Mr. Mayor. That would certainly be our intention. As we're doing biannual road surveys, we have new information available to us on a more regular basis. We wouldn't want to lock in roads or some of our road assets too long into the future, as our roads continue to deteriorate over time on an annual basis. We look at them very regularly. So it would be our intention to provide a list on an annual basis. There may be some roads that we have that could be multi-year that could factor into a more multi-year capital plan in that it could be a 2023, 2024 project itself. But it would be our intention to continue to communicate on an annual basis with that updated list.
Super. And so I know that this year we did the road survey, right, with that funny type of vehicle that goes around. Would it be presented, the road results be presented to EIT committee at some point before we do the next road analysis then in 2023?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. We can certainly do that. At our last presentation at EITP, we did bring the updated report in terms of our road condition survey. We're working through the data from this summer at this time. It has factored into some of the work that we're recommending for 2022. Our next survey would be completed in 2023 and certainly provide a more accurate prediction and forecast as to where our road network is trending in terms of the health.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. And my last question then is for Public Works for the forestry. And so we saw that the tree program where we sell to residents was, yes, like highly successful. 1,800 trees for sale for next year's program. Was there 1,800 trees also in this year's, like in year one, which was the 2021 program? Does anyone know?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, there was 1,800 trees that were sold this year as well.
Okay, thank you. And then we're going to do the same number, 1,800 next year, which will probably also sell out in like 3 days. So that's great. And then for the fall tree planting, I see that for 2022, we're going to be planting 1,000 new trees to try to support doubling the tree canopy by 2025. How many trees were planted this past year in 2021? Was that 1,000 as well?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, that is correct. It was about 1,000 this year as well.
Okay, thank you. And I know that some people are going to try to make a delegation tomorrow night to try to increase the number of trees we're planting, because we have a lot of people following the planning applications that have been approved by council over the last little while and the tree losses there. So we have to try to make up for the loss of those trees and also still try to somehow double the tree canopy. So just a heads up to everyone for that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is Councillor Chappelle.
Thank you, Your Worship. I actually have a number of questions. The first question I have is in the budget, you indicated, Mr. Joyce, that 9% of the business is contracted services. I was wondering where you see that going in the future, the contracted services in your departments.
Sure, thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So contracted services, although are needed in certain areas and certain times. There will be an intention to look at all of our services that we are contracting out to see if they can be brought in and can be done at less cost and more effectively. There's always sometimes those opportunities, and I think sometimes we always have to revisit, because even on an annual basis, those the industry can change, and some things that we may be contracting out, we may want to bring back in-house. And then and I always have faith in staff being able to do an incredibly good job at things and do it efficiently and effectively, and they tend to have a lot of ownership to it. But certainly there are sometimes, obviously, some things that do need to be contracted out for various reasons, such as a level of expertise or specific equipment that we simply don't have, and it wouldn't be prudent for us to go and buy. But you know, my intention is similar to what I've done in the last couple of years, is continually look at those contracted services and see what opportunities there are to bring back in-house.
The second question I have is with regards to the corporate asset fleet management. Certainly, I've been pressing this issue for a number of years now, that especially for light vehicles, or is there any interest in the city actually leasing like cars and vehicles, electric vehicles, rather than buying them and owning them and then basically having no value at the end of 4 years, but leasing them instead?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think I noted that as one of the things we were looking at is expanding on that partnership that we have with Enterprise Fleet Management on the vehicle acquisition, and looking at those exact financing strategies for those light duty vehicles, like you said, because there is some opportunities there, and Director Fowler is going to be evaluating those and seeing if we can take advantage of those and you know, a greater cost savings to the city.
Fowler, I see that you have your hand raised. Was there anything else that you wanted to add?
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not able to turn my video on for whatever reason. Oh, there we go. Thank you for the question, Councillor Chappelle. We actually have started a program with Enterprise and a pilot project to review leasing light duty assets. It was a program to replace some existing leases that we had. And there's a number of benefits to it. I'll be working with Director Folds on the next steps. It also gives us an opportunity to pilot some hybrid vehicles in certain vehicle categories where electric vehicles may or may not be available as of yet, and allows us to not get into owning something where the technology may be improving over the next couple of years. So we have already started that, Councillor Chappelle.
Thank you, Mr. Fowler. That's excellent news. And then my final question actually dovetails to what Councillor Stanek was talking about. And I know through previous conversations that you're aware that March 5th, 2019, we declared a climate emergency. And there certainly is an increased amount of public attention on trees and the environmental benefit it plays in moderating climate change. And as Councillor Stanek alluded to, many residents are very upset with the perception of developers clear-cutting contributing woodlots for development and expressing little regard for climate change concerns. Yet we're seeing mature woodlots being cleared at unprecedented rates. So we have a budget of $550,000 in the forestry department. But in order to align the forestry department possibly more closely to council's direction on climate change, I'm wondering if you had received or thought of increasing the budget for trees to compensate for the loss of mature canopies that we're currently experiencing here in Kingston.
Thank you. It's a good question. Through you, Mayor Patterson. I would say that, so first of all, you know, we got to be careful, because a removal of a tree does not equal one tree planting. canopy is very different. And I know right now the plan has been that we do tree canopy survey every between, I think it's 7 and 10 years. We're going to change that plan. We're going to do a tree canopy survey every 2 years because I think the only way that we're really going to be able to measure how well we're doing in terms of meeting council's target for the canopy is if we're actually measuring it on a more regular basis. Because in a single year, you could lose a lot of trees very easily. And if you're only doing that canopy survey, over a longer period, then you may not catch that. And it could take a long time. We could be chasing our tails. So I think the first thing is we need to actually look at the tree canopy and assess that, because the level of plantings may not be adequate to compensate for the loss of canopy, but we need to measure that to make sure that we are getting that. And then if that calls for increased investment in our forestry program, then that's what will be coming forward to council for consideration. Absolutely.
Thank you, Commissioner Joyce. As always, your answers are on point and very optimistic, and I appreciate the work that you do. And your team, of course.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Mayor Ostroff.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Patterson. Thanks for the presentation. The question is related to transit, and is the delay in expansion in the Woodhaven area related to budget or coordinations, or is it why is it so late in the year? And are there any other areas did I miss that? Are we planning already for the areas with the bridge and all that? Is that 2023's plans with the buses picking up that area off of Highway 15?
Through you, Your Worship, with respect to timing for Woodhaven and the delays, first of all, the overall delay is related to the impacts of COVID, obviously, and a deferral of that expansion as it relates to that. The decision to implement service in September aligns to what was in the initial business plan for a fall launch of that service, although a couple of years ago, but also more directly related to our current staffing levels, Deputy Mayor Oosterhoff, that even if we wanted to deliver that service on January 1st, currently with our current staffing levels, we're not there. So we need to staff to deliver that service. Budget approval now allows us to start the process to hire for those expanded positions and implement the service in September. It's also been our experience that service is better launched in the fall, not during winter months and not during the summer when it's harder to get attention when you're trying to attract new riders.
Okay, and is there expansion for the Highway 15 zone?
Thanks for that question. So within our last business plan, which was to end like in 2021, we had not yet identified service for the third crossing because we anticipated our business plan would wrap up. We would do a new business plan and the third crossing would be in place. And in fact, I think when we did our last business plan, the project had not even proceeded that far. So our intention is in 2022, as we review ridership levels, most importantly, our intention is to look at our future service plans and determine what the next steps would be in terms of future service expansion. So at this point in time, to answer your question directly, we have not identified an expanded service on the Highway 15 corridor, Highway 2 corridor, or on the third crossing at this time.
All right. Thanks very much.
Next is Councillor Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to thank Councillors Stanek and Chappelle for their questions about trees. I think that's a big deal with the public right now, that we're allowing them knocking down more trees than we can possibly put up. So I'm glad to hear what's happening there. Also about the winter control in Toronto just recently on garbage pickup. the report indicated that the private sector was not cheaper and not better than the public service. So my question has to relate to the transportation and public works budget overall. And it shows the revenue growing as one would expect, fairly modestly, but for 2023 and 2024, and then it starts to drop. And I'm just wondering what that's behind that trend. What is causing it to drop in 2025?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, the forecast was it with a particular department you were seeing?
No, this is overall. I thought it was connected to maybe transit, and then I found that a bit alarming. But then I realized, no, it's the two, transportation and public works. It's on page 6, and it's goes 20 million, 20 million, 56, and then suddenly 20.078, like drop a $500,000 there, when normally you wouldn't expect that. It seems to me.
Yeah, I'd have to look honestly a little closer at that to see what revenue. It could be subsidies, could be fees and charges. I'm not sure. I will have to dive into that a little more to be able to get that answer for you.
Okay. Can we get that answer tomorrow? Or?
Yes.
That, all things being equal, of course.
Yep.
Later will be fine as that. Okay, thank you. That was my central question.
Okay, I see that Ms. Kennedy's raised her hand. Ms. Kennedy, do you have anything to add there?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I was just looking. I think, Council Hutchison, if I'm correctly understanding your question, you're looking at the forecasts. The one main thing in the forecast is the increase in transit, because we are still utilizing, as I mentioned earlier, some of the provincial gas tax funds that we tucked away because we use Safe Restart monies instead. Those are going to fall off the table. And so I think that's the main thing that's actually driving that up as we go out. I think by 2025, that's increasing that group. If you're looking at that group as a whole, I think that's where the main increase is. But we can certainly provide more detail for you specific to the departments.
Sorry, Councilor Hutchison, you're on mute.
What I said was, thank you. That was a generous offer. It's just that provincial money is being spread out to 2025. Is that what I gathered from the treasurer's comment?
Kennedy?
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor, that's correct. So we had the provincial gas tax monies that we were able just to put aside and invest, and we're gradually bringing those in as the transit revenues come back up. We're still using those to offset that difference, but by then they'll be completely brought back in. So we won't have those extra funds back in by that point.
Okay, thanks very much for that.
Okay, next is Councilor Bowman.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you, this will be a question for Director DaCosta there as far as transit expansion there. It's going to follow up on what Councilor Oosterhoff was asking, and I believe you commented that it was basically going to be looked at for 2022. I guess in the grand scheme of things, there was talk about a pilot project being built into the budget for the rural area. So could you just elaborate on where that is? Because I know that we're getting a lot of pressure from that, and there's going to be budget issues with that. So it'd be nice for us to be able to go back to our constituents and just kind of say that it's being looked at. There's a timeline, because it just constantly seems to sort of, I get COVID happen and everything's been pushed back, but it'd be nice to just give them a little bit of a timeline. And what are the budget implications of running a pilot such as that?
So I see Seal Hurdle. as well as
yeah, whoever.
whoever would like to jump in on that.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So thank you for the question, Councillor Bohm. And on the pilot for the rural area, so a couple of updates for City Council. We've had some interest from surrounding municipalities to look at how they can work with the City of Kingston to pilot something. So Gananoque, for example, in South Frontenac, where we're seeing a lot of people, obviously, that are traveling in and out of those areas and coming into the city. So we are in the process of pulling some information together and working with those two municipalities. We have applied for a grant actually that would help to finance the development of this pilot, but you're correct. During COVID, obviously, we did put that on hold, and that was reported to council. We were having a hard time with our urban ridership, so it was definitely not the time to explore a new service in the rural area, but we have actively started to work on that with our neighboring municipalities.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, next is Councillor Neal.
Oh, and thanks, Commissioner Joyce, for talking about doing a tree canopy study more frequently. And Councillor Chappell raised an important point. Those of us on planning committee see some of the same developers clear cutting constantly to expand their development envelope. And I'm just curious, is it possible for you also to review how we charge for removal of trees by developers so that we might be able to raise more funds to allow for tree plantings? And I see Ms. Agnew has her hand up.
Thank you, and through you. So thank you for the question, Councillor Neal. I'm happy to provide some information, and Commissioner Joyce may want to add some additional information. But the administration of the city's tree bylaw is done jointly by planning services with collaboration from with the forestry and the public works group. So we do work collaboratively on it. All of the tree assessments that are done through the forestry group. That's a subgroup of public works. So they're out in the field looking at all of the information and doing that analysis and doing the confirmations of the tree assessments and the values. And that's important related to the compensation ratio that's spoken to in the tree bylaw, so that when and if trees have to be removed as part of the development process, the city is fairly compensated in accordance with that bylaw. So that is work that's jointly done between our departments now and will continue to be in the future.
Yeah, I guess the frustration that Councillor Chappell shared is that we have old growth or fully grown trees being removed, and the city accepts money for that. But what gets planted in its place will take decades before you can really count it as a canopy tree. And that's the frustration, I think, that people are feeling.
So I'm wary of going into policy versus budget. So your first question, Councillor Neal, was bang on with the budget question, but I think at this point I want to just keep it on the budget at least.
Okay, so I think what the mayor is suggesting is that my question about examining the tree removal policy might be in order as well at this time. So, Mr. Joyce, could you comment on that?
So that wasn't exactly what I meant. So no, budget time is not the time to open up any policy and to have a look at it. That's something the council can do, but not in the middle of a budget.
Or EITP could with the recommendation of council. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions for Commissioner Joyce? Okay. Seeing none, then we will move to our next presentation. I expect this will be our final presentation of the evening, just to even out our workload between tonight and tomorrow. So at this point, we will move to corporate services, and I'll invite Acting Commissioner Desjardins to take the floor and to walk us through this department presentation.
Your Worship and members of council, I'm pleased to come before you this evening as Acting Commissioner of Corporate Services to present our 2022 budget. But before I begin, I would like to thank Commissioner Joyce, who did much of the heavy lifting of putting this budget together, and to the directors of the corporate services departments for their passion and hard work in the budget development, but also in the work they do every day. I'd be remiss if I also didn't reference the incredible work of the CFO and her entire financial team for schooling me in the budget process. I've had 4 weeks on the job, and it feels like I've been cramming for an exam. So hopefully I pass the test this evening. As council is aware, the corporate services portfolio provides critical services, support services to departments across the organization and to other outside agencies that enable the efficient and effective delivery of programs and services to our residents. Much of our hard work is not seen, but is vital to the day-to-day operation of our organization. I'm gonna keep the recommendation advice I got was to be brief. So I'll end my comments there and get right into the budget. Next slide, please. The combined corporate services portfolio of budgets for 2022 totals $18.365 million. It is recommended a 4.31% increase over last year. Despite the progress we continue to make in emerging from the social and economic impacts of the pandemic, Corporate Services Department continues to see pandemic-related impacts on our budget, from cost deliveries of services through new digital platforms to growing impacts of supply chain disruptions. This has required considerable attention and vigilance to control costs, including contract services, which I know are a concern of many on council. It has also required us to seek new and innovative ways to deliver efficient and effective services. Next slide, please. The capital budget for 2022 is $22.8 million and is confined to 2 departments, facilities management and construction services, and information systems and technology. The projects within these envelopes include resources to maintain, secure, and grow our infrastructure across the corporation. I will provide further detail on capital budget items later in this presentation. Next slide. The first department up is human resource and organizational development, with a recommended increase of 2.67%. The massive disruptions of the workforce over the past 20 months is likely to be one of the most profound and long-lasting effects of the pandemic. This was equally true for the city. It will be critical to the organization to both attract new staff, but also grow and retain existing team members in order to continue to deliver excellent municipal services. Work this coming year will focus on investing in systems and services to support the physical and mental well-being of our team. We are also committed to embracing equity, diversity, and inclusion in all HROD initiatives. We will commit resources to train and grow the next generation of leaders as we see the baby boom generation retire from the labor force over the next 5 to 6 years. Next slide. The next department is facilities management and construction services, which is recommending a 6.7% increase. There is an incredible amount of activity at the FMCS department planned for the coming year. Building on the highly successful strategy to centralize and the oversight of corporate facilities and thereby benefit from economies of scale, the ability to target GHG reduction and source operational efficiencies, the department is now responsible for 92% of all city facilities. I think that's 138 facilities. The department also has a sizable list of capital projects that will be leading this year and continues to demonstrate their expertise and excellence in delivering on budget and on time projects. An increase in contracted services is being driven this year by these addition of these new facilities and the assumption of the delivery of additional services from other departments. I would also reference the increase in utility costs that was mentioned earlier by our CFO. Next slide. The capital budget for FMCS is $17.38 million and includes $6.5 million of heritage properties, including the Frontenac County Courthouse and work at City Hall, among others. Next slide. Non-heritage capital investments of $9.2 million include important renovations of Rita Crest Home and work at the Kingston Fire and Rescue. Asset management work of $1.4 million will support the energy and asset management plan and critical health and safety compliance work. Next slide. The Office of the City Solicitor or Legal Services will see a modest increase of 1.26% increase for 2022. In addition to providing in-house representation at court proceedings, ongoing advice to support city departments, everything from procurement matters to contract drafting, review, real estate transaction, bylaw drafting, just about everything under the sun. The department will continue to work to eliminate the POA court backlog caused by the pandemic. There will also be an additional POA work to address the implementation of the red light camera program and the transfer of Part 3 POA proceedings from the province that Council approved at the last Council meeting. Next slide, please. The Office of City Clerk will also see a modest increase of 1.4% in 2022. Work this coming year will include ongoing transitioning of information and record management work from paper-based to cloud-based systems. The clerk's office will also be leading the execution of the 2022 municipal election and development of a very important multi-year accessibility plan. I will wait until the end of my presentation to have the city clerk address Councillor Neal's question with respect to support for council at the end. Next slide, please. On to information services and technology, IS&T. The budget is recommended to increase by 3.28%. with a considerable amount of work focused on upgrade and maintenance of critical IT systems and the digitizing of services to improve customer experience. Next slide. The department will also develop a new data and analytics strategy and implement a standard analytics platform to facilitate improvement of reporting and expand data-driven decision-making across the corporation. They will also establish an important new digital accessibility program to ensure that the city's digital content meets AOD compliance requirements. Next slide. The Information Systems and Technology capital budget includes $5.42 million in work divided into three categories. The first is running the organization. $2.5 million will be invested to keep our existing IT systems working efficiently. Secondly, secure. $200,000 will be invested to secure security software and technologies to ensure we maintain our systems. And finally, $2.7 million to grow and transform our organization by investing in projects that will focus on the growth of digital service delivery, something that the CFO referenced in her presentation. We received quite a few comments in the public engagement section about digital services. Slide 13, next. The next department is Communications and Customer Experience, which will see an 8.51% increase. This increase reflects an important focus on customer experience in the coming year and will include a user-centric redesign of our city website in collaboration with IS&T. The onboarding of all city departments in the new customer relationship management tool is designed to improve service quality and efficiency to residents. And finally, the creation of service standards for key departments that interact with the public regularly will be an important step towards improved customer service. We'll also see an ever-present need to add additional non-tax revenue, and we'll be implementing a new program for sponsorship and revenue generation to support both corporate and community priorities. Next slide. Following on the same themes as the last slide, 2022 will see us build on existing public engagement systems to increase channels we use to communicate with the public and create easier ways for all residents to interact with the city. This will include modernizing the city's phone system to create an easier and more straightforward experience for the public. The increase in our budget is being driven by the expansion of service levels at the new Kingston East Community Center and our focus on customer experience and customer service. Next slide. And lastly, the Commissioner's Office, which will actually see a tiny decrease in 2022. Work this coming year will be concentrated on the development of a new corporate operations strategy to better support internal innovation in service delivery, improve alignment of processes and planning that will in turn increase communication and build capacity. In addition, we'll also be working to further develop a proactive risk management culture of the city through the review of operational procedures and workflows to support the creation of a risk management process and strategy. This will include education, risk reviews that will contribute to the development of mitigation and loss reduction tactics. I think that's everything. Hopefully I haven't gone too fast, and I'm happy to answer questions, but again, I'll call on the city clerk to address Councillor Neal's question right now, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Thank you. Sorry, is the city clerk there?
He's here. Thank you, Commissioner Desjardins, and thank you, Councillor, for that question with respect to the council support. Just for some context, I can indicate that on July 13th, 2021, Council approved the composition and the mandate for the Citizen Committee to review council remuneration for the upcoming term. In addition to reviewing the mandate of remuneration for the committee, I can confirm the committee is also reviewing the current demands and workload of the mayor and members of council and the need for the administrative assistance for councillors. The committee work plan includes a survey of members as well as the opportunity for members to participate in an interview. The committee will be finalizing the survey and interview questions in the next couple of weeks, and the survey and interview will include questions to assess councillors' workload as well as to gauge the collective need for administrative support. I can also confirm that we are in the process of repositioning some staff resources as part of the budget process to assist council with the dedicated support, and an announcement will be made shortly. What I can also indicate is that we are also looking at funding this particular position for 2022. We would look to draw from the working fund reserve, and I can also confirm that we have included funds in the 23 and 24 budget, recognizing the probability of this initiative going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll open up to the questions from council. Councillor Neal.
Thank you to the clerk. So my understanding from your answer is that there will be funds available to get it started in 2022, that we won't have to wait till next year's budget process.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Neal. You are correct. Funding is available from the department, and if we move forward, we will access and draw from the working fund reserve to make it more of a reality.
Thank you. I look forward to that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions?
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you, Commissioner Desjardins. You mentioned the backlog, the court backlog right now because of COVID, I think, right? With provincial offenses, the POAs, that there's a big backlog. What type, like, how would do we think that backlog will be addressed and will be back to normal in 2022? And do we know kind of when that backlog might no longer be a backlog? Like, do you think it's going to be in Q1 next year, or is the backlog going to continue until September? Like, how many cases are we behind, and how can we address that?
Your Worship, through you to Councillor Sanek, that's a very good question. Certainly, it is our intention to address this backlog as soon as possible. Perhaps our Director Morley might want to join the response. But again, customer service and the redesign of our work around the POA is a priority for us.
Ms. Morley.
Through you, Your Worship. At present, our backlog is anywhere between about 500 and 700 files. We've just resumed trials as of this month by Zoom. We have court dates now fully booked up until the end of the year. So it's certainly an intention moving forward that we'll get back to pre-pandemic levels. We're also staffing up the prosecutions team to include a prosecutions clerk who will certainly be helpful in getting that backlog reduced shortly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, are there any other questions? Okay. Well, that went a little bit faster than I'd expected. So here we are. It's 8:52. So sorry, Councillor Hill, you're waving at me.
Well, just, I mean, if we have some time and we can knock another one off, maybe we could do that tonight as opposed to cutting out early.
So my commitment was to stop somewhere between 9 and 10. So it's very close to 9. So I guess the first thing that I would need to know, I first need a signal from Commissioner Agnew if she is ready and prepared to go, because I had mentioned earlier that we probably would start with her tomorrow. Commissioner Agnew?
Thank you, Mayor Patterson. I certainly can go, but at the last verbal instruction, I did give my directors permission to exit the meeting because I didn't think we'd be going this evening. So I would be soloing, which is fine if council would like to proceed. But a number of our directors have left the meeting.
Yep. Well, one possibility, Councillor Hill, is that we could have Commissioner Agnew present, and then we could start with questions tomorrow. Because I guess the questions, and if all the directors are present, then we could just save questions. So Commissioner Agnew, if you're okay, then if you want to present, we'll do your presentation, and then we'll recess right after, and people can stew on their questions until tomorrow at 6.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Mayor Patterson and Councillor. Certainly, I am happy to be here tonight. I was previously joined by a number of directors, which may be watching and joining back to the meeting. In community services, we are a bunch of departments and very busy people. 2021 has certainly been an incredibly busy year for us. I believe we did over 230 reports to committees and council and moving a lot of very important strategic initiatives forward for the community. So we're happy to be here with you tonight to talk to you about our budget for the following year. Next slide, please. In terms of the operating budget, this shows you a breakdown of the departments that are within the community services portfolio. We have planning services, parking services, which will be joining us in 2022, and I'm going to talk to you about that later on in the slide deck. Licensing and enforcement services, building services, heritage services, and our long-term care facility, Rio Crest. So overall, in terms of the community services budget for the following fiscal year, we're looking at a total increase of 5.4%. Some departments like planning services are seeing a reduction in their budget over previous years, and then some of our other departments are increasing, and I'm going to talk to you about the reasons why we're requesting those increases through this budget process. Next slide, please. In terms of our capital budget asked for 2022, we're just over 4.3 million. We have some money in the WIP associated with each of the departments, and I will talk to you about that as we go through each departmental slide deck. But in terms of planning services, about $1.4 million, lots of additional planning work continuing through 2022 into 2023 on the planning policy side, so money associated with those projects. In parking services, we have some money there associated with capital and asset maintenance of those lots. Building enforcement services, a couple $100,000 associated with hardware and equipment and upgrading technology and platforms to be able to bring those services onto Dash. Heritage services, we have some money in there associated with the completion of various projects that I'm going to talk to you about, and some additional money in long-term care for some capital improvements as well. Next slide, please. So focusing in on the planning services group, as we've talked about tonight, obviously there's been a lot of growth in the city over the last couple of years, which has provided a really critical input into this year's budget process. Since the beginning of council's term, we're at close to 4,000 new residential units that have been added to the housing stock that are either constructed and occupied or in the process of construction. So it's been an incredibly busy couple of years for planning services. and then building services as well, as they process all of the permit applications and do all of the associated inspections. So looking at 22 to 25 in terms of what planning services is going to be undertaking, again, the completion of a number of the planning studies, some of them that have been underway. Central Kingston will be finishing in the new zoning bylaw. Certainly we've had quite a few public conversations about those lately. The North Kingstown secondary plan will be picking back up and completing in 2023. Again, looking at the implementation of the new city zoning bylaw requires a web application and all the supporting data so that we have a really interactive, awesome map portal for people to be able to access information in a digital format. We're going to be commencing the second phase of density by design. Council may remember that we completed the first phase of that for Williamsville. We're now going to be moving in 2022 to focusing on the central business district for density by design for the downtown area in particular. We're also going to be looking at completing a number of the precursor studies that we need to have in our arsenal when we're looking at the 2023 official plan review. So the updates to the population, housing, employment, our commercial inventory. So those are studies that we'll be undertaking over the next couple of years to prepare us for the comprehensive review of our official plan, which starts in 2023. We're also going to be looking at some additional analysis and reports to council, looking at financial tools that are best incentives with respect to affordable housing. And of course, thanks to the change to the provincial legislation, we have to create a new community benefits charges strategy, and we'll be doing that in 2022 as well. Again, one of our key priority focuses will always remain to be the timely processing of development applications, as they are critical for our community as we continue to need housing and we are challenged by housing affordability. And our staff will continue to support Ontario Land Tribunal hearings as needed. Next slide, please. In terms of the planning services budget for 2022, we're looking at actually a 3.5% decrease from what we saw in 2021, so about $42,000. And really that comes down to 2 contract planner positions that we've created specifically to help with the heavier volume of workload that I've just been talking to you about, particularly on the policy side. And these positions are suggested to be funded from the working reserve. We're also looking at some modest fee increases that went as part of the fee report that council just received at their last meeting, and that's going to generate some additional revenue for the department. Overall, in terms of our work in progress, as staff, we use the terminology WIP, but that's actually what it stands for. Sometimes we forget to actually explain that. So that's money that's already approved in our capital budgets that we're working through associated with approved projects. So we still have some work in progress funds associated with the comprehensive zoning bylaw, the Central Kingston growth strategy, and North Kingstown. So as I indicated, the first 2 we're aiming to complete in the first quarter of 2022, and North Kingstown will pick back up late in 2022 and be completed in 2023. In terms of new capital asks for 2022, we're looking at some additional funds, again, to commence that density by design phase 2, focusing on the central business district, some additional funds to continue with the development of a 3D strategy for all of our GIS mapping and building out a digital twin of the city, which is incredibly important as we develop new policy. It enables us to look at new designs and policy work in 3D renderings, which has been an important tool, and we need to continue building that out. Again, mentioned already that we have to develop a new community benefits charge strategy. So we have some funds set aside for that. And again, the precursor studies that we need to complete to be prepared to do our official plan review in 2023, we have some funds allocated for that as well. Next slide, please. So licensing and enforcement services and what this department looks like in terms of workload over the next number of years. One of the key things I wanted to highlight for council this evening is that we are going through an organizational change early in 2022, and that is to integrate parking services into the community services portfolio. So this will really include an opportunity for us to streamline citywide enforcement and create a one-window approach for residents. And we really want to do that to focus on the resident experience and to reduce the overlap of service and to see a reduction in contracted services specifically from how we've operationally managed this work in the past. We're going to continue to partner with Queens and St. Lawrence College to improve bylaw and property standard strategies, with partners for move in, move out, as well as some of the other large events that we experience throughout the year and do have an impact on the community. We're going to strengthen community relationships and continue to do that through stakeholder engagement and collaboration on service expectations and increase awareness of bylaw enforcement as we continue to develop new strategies. Education is always the cornerstone of our enforcement strategy as a city, and we'll need to continue the good work that's been done over the last number of years and just build on that in the years to come. We're looking at increasing the fee for service and bylaw compliance through the addition of administrative monetary penalties. Council has already been supportive of the use of AMPs for a number of our bylaws, but as one of our strategic priorities, we're going to be looking at the ability to use AMPs for enforcement of additional bylaws to those that we have in effect right now. And we're also going to be continuing to focus on moving these services over to DASH, which is our development and services hub, and to implement the licensing and enforcement module to help with online payments for business, trades, animal licensing, again, digitizing our services so we have that consistency of service for all of the services across the community services portfolio. Next slide, please. So in terms of the 2022 operational budget, the licensing enforcement group, we're proposing a 3.9% increase, which is a total increase of about $50,000. So when we look at the variance between the 2021 and the 2022 budgets, it comes down to a couple of key changes. So we're looking at an additional position in the supervisor of policy and licensing to help with the alignment of the service coming over into the community services portfolio. We're also looking at having to address wage increases for the enforcement officer's position that resulted from a job evaluation process that took place in 2021. So that was an unexpected change. We're also looking at reduced revenue in general bylaw AMPs with emergency orders expiring. So compared to what we had in terms of revenue projections for 2021 versus 2022, we did see a need to reduce those based on the fact that a number of the emergency orders will be expiring this year. And some of those emergency orders were associated with the higher fine amounts that we were able to issue through AMPs. So we've adjusted our budget accordingly in 2022. In terms of the works in progress for this department, about $288,000, and that's primarily associated with the DASH implementation for licensing and enforcement module. We have a small amount of money for furnishing and some hardware for building services in terms of field equipment for the building officials. And looking at the 2022 capital ask for this department, some additional money again to complete the DASH implementation for licensing and enforcement. We split it over 2 years, and additional field hardware for consolidated enforcement service as we have to address some technology differentials with bringing parking services over into this group and getting all of the staff working on a common technology platform. Next slide, please. So looking at the building services group again, this has been an incredibly busy group over the last number of years, and happy to report that we've been able to exceed that council priority of 3,000 units within your term. At present, we're just under 4,000 units in the last 3 and a bit years. So that group will continue to focus on, going through the permit process, meeting all those provincial legislated timelines for permit review, and then doing all the associated inspections and occupancy for any type of new spaces. This group will continue to educate the public and strengthen the community through relationships with stakeholders and engagement focused on service expectations and to increase awareness on building code safety. This continues to be an important area. We certainly, through the pandemic, had seen a number of examples of construction without permits going on. And sometimes it's just really a lack of awareness in the community in terms of what the expectations are or when certain projects require building permits, period, or changes that are going on constantly in the industry. This group will continue to look at enhancing the DASH service that they have and really bringing on building enforcement cases into this platform. And again, focusing on the user experience of this platform. once you develop a digital platform, it's not something that stays static. It's something that requires continual maintenance and review, and that's an ongoing process for the building services group. They are using Dash now, but we're always looking at ways to improve the functionality of that platform and to certainly improve the user experience based on feedback that we get from customers on a regular basis. So we're also going to continue to look at process improvement and consistency through staff development and training to remain current with industry standards and changing legislation. I think we can all agree that the current provincial government has brought in a lot of legislative changes over the last couple of years, and there's many more that are forecasted to come with respect to the building services portfolio. This could include the harmonization of with the National Building Code and other functional changes that are happening all the time within the building industry, particularly as it relates to being prepared for innovations in building technology, mass timber, use of different types of materials, certainly changes with respect to greenhouse gas, building efficiencies and all of those pieces. So our staff need to continue to be right on the top of and the cusp of all of those changes and be prepared to be able to see all of that through any permitting process that comes through our door. And again, we will continue to have efforts on emergency orders to support the emergency hospital and shelter services that have been established through COVID and the alteration of those structures, knowing that the emergency orders are going to be transitioning in 2022, and our staff will have to continue to work and help in dealing with those facilities as they transition out as well. Next slide, please. So the Heritage Services Group, this is a new group that was established in 2021. So you will see a large budget increase from for 2022 over 2021, because when we built that budget, the Heritage Services Department didn't exist. But this has been a really exciting opportunity that's come to the city of Kingston that again is aligning us on the cutting edge of cultural heritage planning. And this new department has been busy. They've been up and running for about 6 months, and they're going to continue to really focus on their operations and the community needs and strategic plans for the city, specifically looking at the Your Stories, Our Histories project, the third crossing naming, extending heritage programming to rural Kingston, and supporting diversity, inclusion, in history and heritage. So this group is also going to support heritage as a dynamic part of community placemaking in support of local and regional tourism. Heritage property designations will continue to be a focus. Service level agreement and the Kingston Association of Museums, so that's CAM that we know in short form, arts and galleries, historic sites, and the City of Kingston Cultural Fund and Built Heritage Grants, so they'll continue to administer all of those funds and go through the adjudication processes. The Engage for Change Phase 3 will be concluding and transitioning towards aligning Indigenous initiatives across the corporation. So again, really fanning that out and not having it sitting within one department, but really being focused on a distributed leadership approach as it comes to Indigenous initiatives. We're going to be continuing to work on transitioning the city museums, the Heritage Resource Center, and City Hall tours back to more routine business coming out of the pandemic. And that's been a bit of a slow process. So that will certainly be a focus in 2022. And then also completing the mandate of the Heritage Kingston Working Review Group and returning recommendations to council. So council will see a report coming back to them in the first half of 2022 with respect to that working group. Next slide, please. In terms of the Heritage Services budget, this is the large variance that has showed up. It's a variance of about $254,000. And we see that variance because, again, as part of the 2021 budget, this department didn't yet exist. So this was a budget change that happened mid-year. So as a result, we're seeing a large variance show up in the 2022. So really the large variance is to do with the additional director position. So that's Director Jen Campbell, and manager position that oversees that portfolio. And also looking at museum and heritage programming revenue losses also account for that variance as well, with impacts due to COVID-19. This group currently has about $880,000 in works in progress associated with these various projects: City Hall exhibition, heritage programming, Heritage Resource Center development, Engage for Change, Your Stories, Our Histories, and heritage planning policy projects. So those are all projects that are underway, and there are funds that have already been approved associated with them. And in terms of the 2022 capital ask, about $600,000, Again, this is really going to be focused on doing a major update to the Kingston Archaeological Master Plan, which needs to be done, looking at a market score HCD expansion, and that will be done in partnership with planning services related to the phase 2 density by design policy work, and then also looking at the civic collection public art maintenance. Next slide, please. So transitioning on to Rideau Crest, our long-term care home, talk about a bunch of very hardworking, dedicated professionals that have done a tremendous job over the last couple of years of steering the facility and all of our residents through COVID. In terms of 2022 to 2025, again, looking at some operational and staffing changes, and Ms. Kennedy already alluded to this in terms of new funding strategies coming from the provincial government to move long-term care facilities to 4 hours of direct care per day per resident. So we will be doing that incrementally. There's 3 funding sources that will come over the next 3 years associated with those provincial funds, and that will result in a number of new staff positions that have been strategically positioned to ensure that we're really focusing on direct care for residents and getting those residents to 4 hours of care per day by 2025. So Rideau Crest, in partnership with our facility management construction services group, are going to continue to modernize and update the home to ensure a safe and secure environment. And this is going to include the continued upgrading of resident washrooms, which began in 2021, completion of the tub and shower rooms for residents, expansion and modernization of resident common areas and dining rooms. And some of that was also discussed with council over the last couple of years, especially for spacing and cleanliness and infection control, and also looking at replacement of elevators within the facility to ensure they're fully operational. The home's also going to continue to work with community partners across all provincial directives and infection control related to COVID-19. We are in the 4th wave, so this remains a very significant reality for everybody that's living at Rideau Crest, and certainly all the very dedicated staff that work there every day. That will continue to be a strong focus through 2022 and likely into 2023, as a number of the directives from the province, some of them are likely to remain or continue with time. The home will really focus and continue to focus on engaging with residents and families through regular communications. This has been really critical through the pandemic, so that families have up-to-date information on changes as quickly as possible, and helping to communicate anything that's related to impact to access to their loved ones at certain times during the pandemic, and really making sure that our residents have the highest quality of life, the highest quality of care, and really those families that are supporting residents in our facility are feeling like there's a very high level of satisfaction. And again, lastly, we're going to be continuing to build on partnerships with the Ministry of Long-Term Care, Local Health Integration Network, KFLNA, and really looking at Accreditation Canada on quality improvement and legislative compliance. Our home has just gone through the process of being accredited again through Accreditation Canada, and certainly as part of that, they have reports that look at new ideas and things that we can integrate into the home. So we'll be developing a strategic plan that takes direction from some of the recommendations coming out of the accreditation process, which was very successful and positive for the home. Next slide, please. So looking at the Rideau Crest budget for 2022, we are seeing a 5.1% increase over 2021. And this is primarily related to increases in compensation costs, so wage inflation, increased staffing related to the increase in provincial funding, and then also looking at increased costs of facility maintenance and accommodation. So that's coming through increased costs that are distributed to departments through the facility services department with the City of Kingston. In terms of their existing works in progress, about $440,000, and that includes the surveillance system upgrade and resident bedside table replacements, which are works that are ongoing and being completed. And then a new ask of $186,000 for 2022, particularly focused on equipment and furnishings. Again, this is looking at infection control and ensuring that we have the type of furniture and services and surfaces that can be cleaned very well to prevent any type of germ spread. And then looking at provincial subsidies for minor capital funding associated with projects as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the Commissioner's Office, a small decrease in the budget, very insignificant year over year. So very much the same budget that council would have received last year. And this budget is primarily just to do with salaries and benefits associated with the folks that report in under the Commissioner's office. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation. Again, just a big shout out to everybody in the community services portfolio. This is a very hard working group of 300 individuals doing lots of projects and making difference in the community every day. I believe all of the directors have now joined since I've been giving the presentation. I was hearing the bing. So I think that may have been them rejoining Zoom, but we're happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to you and to your staff for being flexible and just changing direction there. So yes, so I think I've also received that confirmation that all of the directors are back on the call. So we can take questions. Are there any questions then for Commissioner Agnew or the director's team? Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sometimes it only takes one question to kick things off. Thank you for your presentation. It seems that a great deal is getting done. So thank you for that too. Just one question. It indicated that we've had 3,974 residential units built over the last 3.5 years. And this year we've got 940 units under construction. Is that 940 additional or is it included in the 3,974?
Yeah, thank you and through you. So that's included in the 3,974, Councillor, and that would have been, I think, until October. So there likely will be some additional units that are captured by the time we get to the end of the year. That would have been to the end of October.
Right. So do we keep track of, does the city keep track of the rents for these units? Well, they're not, they're residential units. So some of the, I presume a large number of them are different forms of ownership. Would that be correct?
Yes, through you, there would be different types of of residential units. So those would include single detached dwellings, semis, towns, all the way up to multis. So we're not tracking the individual rents associated with any particular permit, but we are tracking that information quite carefully that comes through CMHC every year and that we report to council, looking at our vacancy rate and our average rentals associated with different size of rentals and average housing prices as well, but not down to the permit level, no, councillor.
Right, but okay. CMHC is kind of crude. Because it involves all the rental units, right? So in the city. So I guess my concern is that the relationship between supply and rental costs to the tenant. Not that the other forms are not important, they are, but that my concern is about affordability for the.
So Councillor Hutchison, I don't disagree. This is a really, really important topic. I'm just trying to check, is this in budget?
I'm just trying to find out more about what's behind the number. That's all. Like sometimes it's reported to tell, we're told periodically, this is how many detached houses, the number of townhouses. I mean,
No, it's fair. I know the number was mentioned in the budget presentation, so that's fair.
Well, the 3,974 was mentioned.
Yep.
There's no breakdown that I saw.
Councillor, if you'd be interested in a breakdown, we do a monthly summary report that looks at all of the residential units by type. I'm happy to share that with council if that's helpful as a follow-up to this. And we can also provide you with the previous years and what the breakdown is by residential unit type, if that's helpful.
Right. Okay, that would be good. I'm interested in the last few years, as you've referenced here. Since supply itself doesn't equal affordability. So that's what I want to know. Thank you.
No, certainly, Councillor, I would agree with you. So I think increasing housing supply is one element of addressing housing issues in the community, but certainly Council would be aware of the number of other interventions that we've been applying specifically as a city to address housing stock at various levels or various areas of the housing continuum, because it is so broad. But your point is well made, and certainly I see CAO Hurdle coming on the screen here. I don't know if you have additional comments related to some of the other specific housing interventions.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So, Councillor Hutchison, you're correct, and it would be impossible to track the rent levels. As you know, sometimes a housing unit may start as ownership and then get rented down the road. So those things can definitely change. In terms of affordable housing units, and probably in the form that you're thinking about, Councillor Hutchison, I just want to remind Council that in the last 3 years, there has been a financial commitment for the creation of 239 units. So, Councillor Hutchison, you will recall that you had brought forward during the strategic plan that we establish a baseline of 90 units, I believe, with $18 million. So I think the city has far exceeded that. I'm not saying that there isn't a need for more, but I do think that there's been some great progress there in terms of number of units endorsed by council.
Do we know where we're at with that application for 1316 Princess Street?
So Councillor Hutchison, again, really good question, really interesting topic. It's just not I just don't see that as a budget question. Although, if I know that CAO Hurdle is presenting on housing tomorrow. So how about if CAO Hurdle talks about that project and raises it, then questions are fair game at that point. Is that fair?
Yep, that's fine with me. I saw she was coming up. Okay, I just wanted to put in context of this report. Thank you.
Okay, next is Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. I have 3 questions. The first one is regarding planning services. I'm surprised that you're presenting such a reduced budget when the key highlights in 2022 to 2025, it sounds like we still have a lot of work to go. And when during the Mayor's Task Force on Housing, we discussed, the challenges and the workload in the planning department. And I know we should be excited that you're not advocating for an increase in your budget, but I just wonder if the loss of those contract workers if we're going to end up at a stage again when we kind of have this backlog of work.
Thank you, and through you, and I certainly really appreciate the continued support relative to the amount of work that's in the planning services group and council's interest in that, especially coming out of the Mayor's Task Force. I think what we've been doing is really focusing over the last couple of years and trying to right size the staff of the department, and we've been very strategic in the way that we have repositioned and replaced individuals that have either been promoted or taken other opportunities. So our staff complement has actually increased incrementally over the last number of years. The 2 additional staffing positions that I mentioned in the budget tonight, they are contract positions because we're feeling with the staff complement and the team we have, the planning services group is very solid and they're doing an excellent job right now. So Director Park, I believe, is also on certainly on the call, but we've been having conversations about and looked at this quite seriously going through the budget process of, do we feel like we have the team we need? We identified that a couple of additional staffing resources to help us get through some of the big policy push and completing Central Kingston and the zoning bylaw in 2022 will certainly be a big help, but that we didn't need to look at creating those as permanent positions at this time, but that contracts would suffice with the rest of the department that we've been able to build up over the last couple of years.
Great, thanks. That's reassuring. My next question is about the heritage fees for services for the heritage applications that weren't really mentioned tonight, but that is like the $300 fee conversation for even small heritage applications. And I wonder if that it was also in the budget, assuming that we're going to definitely approve that $300 application. Because
so yes, Councillor, to answer your question, we had put a revenue projection in the budget associated with the continuation of that $300 fee. But since council at the previous meeting had voted to have that fee removed, it will be removed from the budget. So the actual increase will probably be closer to 15% for heritage services, because that $30,000 did offset some of the operational increase. But in collaboration with Desiree and Lana Folds and in finance, they will just make that adjustment should council approve the whole budget, and that decision on the fees has already been made. So there will be no fees associated with heritage services on the planning side in 2022.
Okay, thanks for that. And my last question is about the heritage services and the new office that didn't exist. But for our community, that really is a great, it certainly offers an, in improvement in quality of life and education and all of that. Like, it's just so really such a positive, that Engage for Change project that I think we should be very proud of. The question is about the future. Do you think there are future opportunities of some revenue generation kind of projects there too? Like, is that like right now we're spending the money building this up, but do we project some income there?
Thinking through you, I might start, and then Dr. Campbell has also joined us and may have some additional comments. Certainly, absolutely, Councillor Doherty. I think Jen Campbell and I have been working for about 6 months together, but we've been talking about the importance of not only creating like a best-in-class service, but how do we financially sustain that, knowing there's so many pressures on the budget, and where could there be unique opportunities for additional programming or opportunities to have additional non-tax revenue coming into the department to help continue to support the sustainability of this group and really be reinvested in the heritage portfolio overall. Jen, I don't know if you want to make some additional comments at all, but certainly that's something that we're looking at. We don't have anything majorly planned for 2022. Certainly council's given us the direction that you want us to engage in some additional consultation prior to looking at any fee introduction for heritage applications. And certainly we're committed to doing that and bringing future reports after we've had an opportunity to do that. But Jen, I don't know if you have any other further comments related to museums or City Hall or anything that you may want to add in addition to Councillor Doherty's question.
Yeah, thank you. And through you, Mr. Mayor. I think I would just add to that we're continuing to see the return to normal revenue levels at the museums. And also, even though City Hall tours are a free service, if you will, we do actually receive significant donations through that process as well. And I would say that, in 2020 into 2021, we were seeing significant losses of revenue. The McLaughlin stayed closed. The increasingly successful programming we were offering there was also removed. And we're starting to put that back into the budget in 21. But I think what Commissioner Agnew is also flagging is that as you move out in those outer budget years is where you start to see us returning back. And even though these are small revenue dollars with museums that are heavily subsidized across the sector, we are still right now projecting into 2022 only about $34,000 in revenue at those sites. And in a pre-pandemic level, we were pulling something around 60 to 70,000. So even to get us back into pre-pandemic revenue models would be a great improvement. And then with the additional opportunities that we're also pursuing to find other opportunities to earn revenue through those community programming outlets, I think we're really hoping that we can see something even more than what we had pre-pandemic.
Fantastic. It was about the sustainability that I was worried about. So that's really great. Thanks.
Next is Councillor Riley.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson, and through you, thank you, Ms. Agnew. I have a question about the forecasting of charges, particularly as it relates to some of the policy work that planning is undertaking right now. I'm thinking of density by design, which was mentioned in the report. Do we think that that policy, once it comes to council, if it's adopted, would lead to a greater increase in DC charges, for example? I just noticed that it was a very small incremental growth on that line year through to 2025. I'm just wondering if once some of that policy work is completed, maybe that would actually increase the revenue that we get from DC charges.
Thank you, and through you. So development charges as it relates to like our next update of the bylaw, or just specifically, I mean, the key thing that would be a driver of any changes with respect to development charges is growth. So I think the critical input to that is going to be the next round of census data, which will be available to the city in January or February, because that's really going to give us the substantiated updated numbers with respect to population and housing in particular. And the information that we've had informing our studies over the last couple of years has been the 2016 census data, because that was the last data set that was available. So I think there could be changes related to that particularly, but we won't know until we see the data and then have that feed into the next development charges update, which is part of the 15-year forecast, if that's what you're picking up on.
Actually, what you said is related to what I'm thinking about, but I'm just trying to consider the impact of increased density through some of the policy work planning is proposing, and the ways in which that could actually increase revenues for the city. And so I think you've answered it maybe in a different way than I had asked, but I think what you said, yeah, satisfied what I was trying to understand.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from council? Councillor Chappelle.
Thank you, through your worship. I have a couple of questions with regards to items in the budget. The first one is the community benefit charges strategy. Community benefits, we've been talking about this since I joined council, and there's a budget cost of $150,000. And so I'd like to understand that cost. Is that for a consultant, or what's involved with $150,000?
Thank you, and through you, thank you for the question, Councillor Chappelle. So in the planning services budget, the department is actually significantly offset, and that's also responsible for some of the variance that you see, or the reduction, in that because there are so many major policy projects that are going on, we're able to recover capital dollars that go into the budget associated with staff salaries. So the money that's allocated there, Councillor Chappelle, is just to recover staff salaries associated with our own internal people that will be delivering that work. That's not for an external contract.
Right. Then following that, then there's the archaeology master plan updates of $75,000, which is really about, I'd like to understand if this is regarding expanding Market Square in downtown and its density by design. And the premise I asked that question is because going back through my notes and looking at and researching, we've already done a market study in 2013. So I don't understand why we'd have to spend another $75,000 doing that.
Thank you, and through you, that's a great question. So the money that's allocated there, that likely would be to retain an external consultant. Density by design, there's a lot of the work that's going to be done in-house, but that's something that Dr. Campbell and I have to speak about relative to balancing the operational work of the department versus the dedicated time that it takes to do all of the in-depth heritage analysis associated with creating new policy in the downtown. So that's really looking at the ability to create new heritage protection by way of policy that would be implemented through density by design, and likely needing to retain a consultant associated with being able to do that, given the fact that the operational work that's continues for the staff on the permitting side is quite high. But Dr. Campbell, you may have some additional comments to offer, so I'll yield to you.
Thank you, and through you, I just want to offer a comment on the Kingston Archaeological Master Plan updates and the budget dollars that I think you were flagging there, Councillor Chappelle. The update to the Archaeological Master Plan, these are scheduled updates to master planning documents that assist us in making calls on when archaeological assessments are necessary as part of planning applications or building applications. So the policy that was developed by the city is essentially, it needs to be updated. And it has been part of work planning consideration for a number of years now, but we're in a position where we now have 2 archaeologists on staff as well, who are able to kind of put their minds around this and be able to lead with that with some internal support, as well as likely some consultation or contracted relationships with a third party. For example, Archaeological Services Incorporated was involved in the forming of the archaeological master plan for the city of Kingston. We were one of the first cities in Ontario to have such a plan, and it needs scheduled updates just as part of routine policy maintenance and updating based on the growth that we've seen in the city, as well as the existing archaeological reports, which alter the model's predictability and its accuracy moving forward.
Approximately how much of that $75,000 would be allocated to a consultant?
At this point, we haven't tested the market, and because the plan hasn't been updated in it's almost 10 years since the plan was initially updated, we don't have a firm number on that yet. So the 75,000 is really a bit of a placeholder based on past policy work and some estimating based on our expectations of what consulting could cost. I would think that in 2022, we would probably be looking at spending approximately 50,000 of the 75,000 that's allocated if we were to contract that work out. There is the possibility that we can handle some of this in-house at a greater degree, which could reduce the amount that we would go out for contract, which would reduce ultimately the spend in this allocation. But that is what the money has been identified based on past contracted works.
I'm assuming that money won't be sole source, it'll actually go to tender or an RFP?
Yes, that's correct.
The 2 things, it'll go to sole source or it'll go to tender?
Oh, I'm so sorry. No, it will go out through a tender, through an RFP process. That will be an open bid.
And then since I have you on the line at the moment, what's this naming interpretive signage? $150,000.
That's the aspects associated with the third crossing, including interpretive cultural signage on the shorelines and adjacencies, and also in support of educational signage, interpretive plaque, etc. That will have to do both with the name, but also the name is a bit of a design element, which will then be able to inform what was always the intent, which was to provide, at the time with cultural services, additional interpretive plaquing and installations on the shorelines related to the natural landscape, the presence of the bridge, and that's all tied into the naming, though it is outside of the kind of infrastructure project that is the bridge itself.
$150,000 just seemed like an obscene amount of money. Like, are we paying for a consultant to come up with the signage and that, or is this something that we're doing in-house?
It's a combination of, sorry, and through you, Mr. Mayor. It's a combination of potential here. Certainly there's the hard costs associated with sign development and installation. So for example, signs on pathways require concrete pads to be laid. We have to have them manufactured. They have to meet accessibility standards. We have translation costs, etc. There are at times out-of-house costs associated with the design components of that. And then if you multiply that by the number of opportunities where we may have signage, so if you think there could be 2 signs on each shoreline, and then perhaps 2 additional signs on the bump out or the view on the bridge, these numbers actually start to add up fairly quickly when you're thinking about permanent infrastructure that would be added. So even though it may be seen like it's a sign, there are some costs against getting signs that are, vandalism resistant, etc. So, we will have to contract perhaps some of the design work out of house, but the actual and the fabrication of the items themselves.
And then my final question, I appreciate that. I just thought that was a crazy amount of money. And then Engage for Change. I mean, this just seems to be the ongoing perpetual fund for life, $50,000. I thought we would be finished with this by now. And so is there an end point for this contract, Engage for Change? Like there's another $50,000 this year. And I mean, this group didn't even present at the tumultuous Johnny McDonald statue teardown. So I'm not happy with them, and I'm wondering why we would continue to pay them.
Thank you, and through you. This is not money allocated to the contracted work with First Peoples Group, if that's what you're referencing, Councillor Chappelle. This is additional dollars to close out the programming of Engage for Change. Phase 3 is the final proposed phase for Engage for Change. As Commissioner Agnew flagged earlier, we're looking to transition Indigenous initiatives into a more operationalized corporate-wide model of implementation. So council, if assuming council supports the closure of phase 3 at the conclusion in March, we will not see continued funding around Engage for Change. We would see the closing out of that as a project and the operationalization of some of the dollars associated with. So we want to get them into the operating budgets so that if we are providing, for example, community event support associated with National Indigenous Peoples Day, and we want to move that into the operating budget, we also want to move into the operating budget any of the other now business as usual aspects of this work across the various departments that will support it.
Thank you very much for the clarification on that. That's helpful. And I do agree. I think we do need to bring it into the other departments as well. So if there's a substantive ongoing support for Indigenous issues and not just paying a consultant that leaves the community when they're done, I think internally is where we need to put the investment.
Thank you
very much.
Any other questions from council? Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands. So Commissioner Agnew and team, thank you very much. It's 9:42. So at this point, we will recess and we will reconvene with the next budget presentation at 6 p.m. tomorrow. Have a good evening and we'll see you then.